Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley, the place where stories linger long after the lights go out. Tonight, we prepared chilling tales paired with the soothing sound of rain to ignite your imagination and make your heart race. If you feel the cold creeping in, tap that like button. It helps keep the shadows alive. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from or share the scariest moment that sent shivers down your spine. Don't forget to subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss what lurks in the darkness ahead. The Devil's Lake in Arkansas. I had always been someone who liked the quiet. The hum of the city was too much for me. The noise, the people, the constant movement, it wore me down. I needed silence, solitude, a place to breathe. That's how I ended up on the road to Arkansas. I was never the type to believe in old legends or ghost stories. That kind of talk was for the superstitious, the people who feared what they didn't understand. But the more I heard about Chortovsk, the so-called Devil's Lake, the more I couldn't help but be intrigued. It was a place that promised isolation, a chance to clear my head and leave the world behind. The locals, though, didn't share my enthusiasm. "Don't go near that lake," they'd say. "It doesn't like company." I wasn't one for warnings, especially from people who couldn't explain the strange things they'd seen. I'd heard the rumors, the eerie cries that echoed through the trees, the strange shapes seen moving across the surface of the water, the way fishermen would always leave empty-handed. But I chalked it up to local superstition, a tale spun to keep outsiders away. It took me almost 6 hours to drive there. The road was long, winding, cutting through dense forests that seemed to close in on me as I went deeper into the heart of Arkansas. The autumn air was crisp, and the scent of damp leaves and pine filled the truck. I didn't mind the solitude of the journey. The road stretched out before me like a promise, an escape from everything that had been weighing me down. The moment I hit the dirt roads leading to the lake, something shifted in the air. The deep quiet of the forest was unsettling, a stillness that felt unnatural. I pressed on, telling myself that it was just the unfamiliar territory, the kind of unease you get when you're in a place you don't quite belong. When I finally saw it, a break in the trees, a sliver of water, the lake appeared exactly as the stories had described it. It wasn't large, but it was vast enough to make its presence known, stretching out in front of me, its surface smooth like glass. A fog had begun to roll in from the water, soft tendrils creeping toward the shore, making it seem like the lake itself was exhaling. I parked the truck near the edge of the water, staring out at the stillness. The reputation of the place was heavy in the air, even if I didn't fully understand it yet. There was something about the lake, something that felt off. I didn't know it then, but this quiet, seemingly peaceful place would soon become my nightmare. I stepped out of the truck, the crunch of gravel beneath my boots the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. The air felt thicker here, like it was heavier, and the mist that drifted across the lake seemed to dampen every noise. The trees around the clearing were tall, dark sentinels, their branches reaching out like fingers, as if trying to draw me into the shadows. The lake stretched out before me, its surface perfectly still, reflecting the overcast sky in a way that made it look almost like a mirror. The water wasn't clear, not exactly. It had a murky quality to it, as if something deep below was disturbing it, even if the surface remained untouched. I stood at the edge, watching the faint ripples form for no apparent reason, like something beneath the water had brushed against it. I set up my camp quickly, trying to keep my focus on the task at hand. The quiet was overwhelming. The occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird sounded too loud, too intrusive, as though the natural sounds of the world couldn't find a place here. I hadn't expected it to be so still. Even the wind, which should have been cutting through the trees, seemed muted, as if the lake itself absorbed it. As I unpacked my gear and set my fishing rod by the water, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. It wasn't a sudden realization, more like a slow creep, a sensation that seemed to build the longer I stood there. My gaze kept drifting to the water, almost against my will. There was something about the way it shimmered that unsettled me, like it was hiding something, or perhaps trying to lure me in. I tried to brush it off. There was no reason to be nervous. It was just a lake, after all. People fished here all the time, so what made me different? But the quiet persisted, and with it came a subtle, gnawing discomfort. A soft rustling from the trees behind me made me tense, but when I turned, there was nothing there. No movement. No animal. Just shadows. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind, or maybe my imagination, working overtime in the isolation. I glanced at the water again, the surface as still as it had been when I first arrived. That's when I saw it. A shadow, just beneath the surface of the water, shifting as though something large was moving slowly, making its way across the lake. I couldn't make out what it was, just a shape, too distorted to recognize, but the movement was deliberate, slow. Almost waiting. I froze, staring at it, trying to understand what I was seeing. Was it a fish? A log? Something else? But the shadow didn't move like anything natural. The more I looked at it, the more it seemed to fade in and out of view, as if it didn't quite belong in the space it occupied. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished, leaving only the ripples behind, expanding outward in perfect circles. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog in my mind. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or some kind of reflection playing on the water's surface. Maybe I was just tired. But a cold shiver ran down my spine anyway, and the silence around me felt heavier, more oppressive, as if the lake was taking notice of my presence. I wasn't sure if I had imagined the shadow or not, but either way, it didn't sit right with me. Something about this place was wrong. It wasn't just the eerie quiet, it was something deeper, something beneath the surface, waiting to be noticed. And I had no idea yet that the lake was just beginning to make its claim. I shook off the lingering unease and forced myself to focus. I was here for one reason, to fish. No matter how strange the lake seemed, it was just a body of water, and I wasn't going to let a few oddities ruin my weekend. I grabbed my fishing rod, assembled it quickly, and cast the line into the water, hoping to break the stillness with the simple motion of the reel. For a moment, all I could hear was the soft hiss of the line cutting through the air, then the faint plunk as it landed on the water's surface. The tension of the string stretched out in front of me, and I leaned back against a nearby tree, the sun beginning to sink lower in the sky. A few thin clouds drifted lazily across the sky, but the day was still, unnaturally so. I was ready to relax. I needed the peace, the time away from everything. The quiet of the lake was the perfect setting for it. But then I heard it. At first, it was just a faint rustling, too soft to pinpoint, like the sound of leaves shifting in the wind. But there was no wind. The trees around me stood perfectly still, their branches unmoving, and yet the sound grew louder. It wasn't just a rustle anymore, it was the unmistakable sound of something moving in the underbrush, just beyond the edge of my campsite. I sat up straight, my hand instinctively tightening on the rod, though I couldn't see what was causing the noise. It wasn't like any animal I had encountered before, too heavy, too deliberate. And the timing was off. It didn't seem like a squirrel or a deer. It was almost as if something was walking through the forest, slow and steady, but without the usual rustling of leaves that animals caused. I stood up slowly, glancing over my shoulder toward the trees. Nothing. No movement, no shadow, no shape. Just the quiet stretch of forest, the fading sunlight filtering through the branches. My heart thudded in my chest, but I pushed the fear away. I had to remind myself this was just the unknown, the unfamiliar woods. It could have been anything. I turned back to the lake and let out a long, slow breath, trying to focus on the water, the steady bob of the fishing line. But the sounds continued, distant but growing. Now, I could hear what sounded like faint whispers. Low voices, barely audible but unmistakable. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the trees. The voices seemed to come from all around me, like someone was speaking just outside of my hearing range, their words lost in the breeze. I shook my head, forcing myself to laugh. "It's just the locals messing with you," I muttered under my breath, dismissing the growing unease. Local superstition. That was all this was. They probably made up the stories to keep outsiders from coming around. I was being foolish. Still, as the whispers grew clearer, the rational explanation started to slip away. The sound wasn't natural. No wind could carry voices like that. It was too precise, too calculated. I stood motionless, my eyes scanning the trees again, searching for something, anything that could explain what I was hearing. There was nothing. Just the dense forest and the lake's quiet surface. I let out a shaky breath and decided to keep my mind on the task at hand. Just as I settled back into my fishing spot, the noise shifted. It wasn't whispers anymore. It was a low, guttural sound, like a growl, faint but persistent. A chill crept down my spine. My hand hovered over the reel, but I didn't move. Maybe it was just an animal, a coyote or some other nocturnal creature. The sound was close, closer than before, but it was so strange that I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't anything I had ever heard. I turned around again, but there was nothing. Just the trees. The same as before. My heart pounded in my chest, but I wasn't about to leave yet. The night was still young. I could brush off the sounds. I could ignore the way my nerves were on edge, how the whispers seemed to float in the air, almost teasing me. The fishing line twitched suddenly, jerking in my hands. I snapped my attention back to the water, the momentary distraction of fear pushed aside by the thrill of a catch. But as I reeled in, something felt wrong. The line didn't feel like it was pulling a fish. It felt like it was tangled with something heavier, something more persistent. Then the line went slack. I yanked it in quickly, but there was nothing there. No fish. Just empty water. I stared at the line, the quiet stretching out once again. The growl was gone now, replaced by the same silence. And yet, it didn't feel like peace. The air around me seemed charged, like the world was holding its breath. There were no signs of life. The forest stood still, the trees unmoving. But the whispers lingered, just beneath the surface of the quiet, and I couldn't help but feel like I was not alone. Something was waiting, watching. And I had no idea what it was. The stillness of the lake had returned, but it wasn't the calm I had been hoping for. The air was dense, as if the very atmosphere was holding something back, waiting for the right moment to break free. I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, but it was hard. The whispers, so faint at first, were beginning to worm their way into my thoughts. I leaned back against the tree, trying to focus on my surroundings, but the silence, once comforting, now felt like a weight pressing in from all sides. I could hear nothing but the occasional snap of a twig in the distance or the faint rustle of leaves stirred by the wind. Or at least, I tried to convince myself that it was the wind. The whispers started again. At first, they were so faint I could barely make them out. Just a murmur, a low hum in the air, like distant voices carried on a breeze that didn't seem to exist. I glanced around quickly, but there was no one there. No movement. No animals scurrying through the trees. I tried to ignore it. Maybe it was the wind, though I couldn't feel any breeze. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The stories I'd heard about the lake, the superstitions. They were nothing but rumors. I had to remind myself of that. Just because the place had a strange reputation didn't mean it was anything more than an isolated patch of wilderness. I grabbed my fishing rod again, trying to focus on something, anything, that would distract me from the eerie feeling crawling down my spine. But as I settled in, the whispers grew louder. Still indistinct, still far too soft to be real voices, but definitely present. They sounded almost familiar. Like someone was calling my name, only the tone was off, wrong. It wasn't a human voice, it was too distorted, like it was filtered through water, or maybe from behind a thick curtain. It was so subtle that I wasn't sure whether it was real or just the effects of being alone in such an unsettling place for too long. I told myself it was nothing. The wind. The rustling of the trees. It was probably some animal, a bird or a small creature, making strange noises in the distance. There were plenty of animals out here, I reminded myself. The lake was far from untouched. But the sounds were growing clearer now. They weren't just whispers anymore, they were words. Fragmented, as if they were being spoken underwater. The syllables, distorted as they were unmistakably human. I stood up, my eyes scanning the surrounding woods once again. The trees were still. Too still. I should have felt the wind by now, the kind that comes just before nightfall, but there was nothing. Only the oppressive weight of the air pressing down on me, suffocating the little breath I had left. The whispers weren't just random anymore. They were coherent, and they were drawing closer. Help, come, closer. The words slithered through the air, so quiet, so faint that I could barely hear them. It was ridiculous. It had to be. This was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind, the result of too many days spent alone. The sound of the water lapping against the shore, the creaking of the branches in the trees, everything seemed to compound into something that wasn't real. I laughed to myself, a nervous, hollow sound. Get a grip, I muttered, shaking my head. You're imagining things. But my heart was racing now, and my hands were clamming around the fishing rod. The whispers continued, faint but undeniable. They danced just out of reach, so soft and distant that I couldn't make out the meaning, but they kept calling, drawing me in. I spun around, trying to locate the source of the sound, but there was nothing. No one. Just the same stretch of forest, the same gray sky hanging above the water. Nothing moved. Not a single leaf. Stop it, I whispered to myself, rubbing my eyes. It's nothing. Just the wind. The damn wind. But the whispers didn't stop. They were closer now, clearer, though still far too distorted to understand fully. I clenched my fists, resisting the urge to look around like some terrified fool. I couldn't let myself give in to this. The stories, those damn stories, had done this to me. They made me paranoid, made me think there was something unnatural in the lake. Something waiting. I needed to ignore it. The whispers repeated, growing more insistent now, but still impossible to understand. Come closer, help me. I stiffened, feeling a cold sweat on the back of my neck. My eyes darted around again, but I could see nothing. The forest was still, silent. The whispers faded back into the air, but not entirely. The faintest trace of them lingered, like an echo that wouldn't quite fade. I forced myself to sit back down. I was being ridiculous. There was nothing out there. No one was watching. No one was whispering my name. It was just my mind, overactive in the quiet. The lake, the forest, they had a way of making a person feel small, insignificant, and when you're alone for long enough, your imagination can get the better of you. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The whispers had stopped, but the unease didn't. I could still hear them in my mind, a quiet reminder that something wasn't quite right. The quiet returned, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was thick, heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. The whispers had faded, but the unease lingered, crawling under my skin. The lake, the trees, the forest, they all seemed to be closing in on me, pulling me deeper into their grip. I tried to shake it off, but no matter how hard I tried, the fear gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. It happened just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The first hint of darkness crept into the clearing, but it wasn't the nightfall that made my heart race, it was the sound. A sound that pierced the stillness, slicing through the quiet like a blade. A scream. A scream that didn't belong in this place. It was distant, muffled by the trees, but unmistakable. A human scream, sharp, desperate, and filled with an unimaginable terror. The kind of scream that makes your blood run cold and your stomach churn with instinctive dread. I froze. My eyes shot to the edge of the forest, searching the shadows for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. The scream had come from deep within the woods, far from where I stood, but it felt as though it had come from inside me, echoing in my bones. It wasn't the scream of an animal. It was too raw, too full of fear. My mind raced. Could it be someone else? A hiker, maybe, someone lost or in trouble? The thought made me hesitate, but only for a moment. Then doubt crept in. No one came out here. No one came to this part of the lake. The stories, the warnings. I glanced at the truck, parked just beyond the campsite, but the road felt miles away. I was alone. And the scream, it had no rational explanation. My rational mind tried to dismiss it as the wind, a tree falling, some wild animal with a strange call. But I knew better. I couldn't deny the feeling that something was wrong. That scream wasn't just a sound, it was a warning. I stood, my legs stiff and unsteady, and looked back toward the water. The lake seemed unchanged, serene, the surface undisturbed, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that it was hiding something from me, something that wasn't quite right. That scream had shattered the fragile calm that I had been holding on to. I walked to the edge of the camp, the light from my lantern flickering in the growing darkness, and stood there, listening. But the forest was silent again. Too silent. The kind of silence that made your mind invent sounds, invent dangers. Another scream tore through the night. This time it was closer. It was unmistakable now. A human voice, pleading, raw, and filled with absolute terror. My stomach churned as I realized the scream wasn't coming from the woods, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere on the lake itself. The sound seemed to roll across the water, carried by some unseen force, chilling the air around me. It was as though the lake itself was alive, amplifying the scream, bending it to its will. I turned back toward the water, the fishing rod forgotten at my side, the line lying limp in the water. My heart pounded in my chest, and the air felt suddenly too thick to breathe. What was I doing here? What was I hoping to find? I had come for solitude, for peace, to escape from everything. But now, in the face of that scream, the reality of where I was crashed into me. This wasn't a place to escape. This was a place that pulled you in, a place that waited for you to let your guard down, to believe you were safe. But it wasn't safe. It never had been. I looked around again, the trees casting long shadows in the dim light of my lantern. The forest, the lake, the very air seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen. I felt small, helpless. Maybe I should leave. The thought was fleeting at first, a whisper of doubt in my mind. But now it had taken root. That scream, it wasn't a sound I could ignore. There was something out there, something far worse than a simple myth or superstition. I didn't know what it was, but I could feel it, growing, lurking just beyond my reach. Another scream echoed in the distance, and this time I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't pretend that this was normal. I took a step toward the truck, then stopped. The thought of leaving felt like a surrender. But the thought of staying, alone, with whatever was making those sounds, made my blood run cold. I glanced once more at the dark water. The ripples on the surface had stopped, and for a brief moment, everything was still again. Too still. I didn't know what was worse, the scream or the silence that followed. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't alone here. The question now was whether I could make it out of the forest alive. And if I stayed, would I ever truly leave this place, or would it take me too? I took a deep breath and forced my feet to move. The walk back to the campsite felt longer than it should have. Each step seemed to drag, each crackling leaf beneath my boots loud enough to make me jump. The darkness was deepening around me, swallowing the forest in its heavy, suffocating grip. The forest, once familiar and comforting, now felt like a labyrinth, each tree a silent witness to my growing unease. The scream had shattered the quiet, but the silence that followed was even more unnerving. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes with the end of an event. It was a silence that pressed in on me from every side, as though the very air had thickened and frozen, holding its breath in anticipation. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me, just out of sight. As I reached the campsite, the first thing I noticed was the air. It was colder, much colder than before. A chill had settled in, creeping through my jacket and making my skin prickle with discomfort. The temperature hadn't dropped that quickly. I glanced at the sky, no sign of a storm, no indication of a sudden cold front. It didn't make sense. I grabbed my jacket tighter around myself, but the cold seemed to seep into my bones, as if the very air was tainted by something far worse than the usual evening chill. The fire had burned down to a few smoldering embers, the last remnants of warmth disappearing into the night. The lantern's light flickered feebly, casting long, eerie shadows that stretched across the clearing. I looked around, half expecting to see someone standing in the dark, watching me, but there was nothing. Nothing but the trees, the fire, and the shadow of my own thoughts. I tried to focus on something, anything, to ground myself. I sat down by the fire, wrapping my hands around a mug of lukewarm coffee, but the warmth didn't seem to reach my core. The cold, that unnatural chill, was still there, lingering like an invisible presence. It was as if the air itself had turned against me, refusing to offer even the smallest comfort. The lake, visible just beyond the clearing, was still and black, the surface reflecting the dim light of the lantern. It seemed to beckon, its stillness so absolute that it almost felt unnatural. My eyes were drawn to the water, unable to look away, as if something in its depths was calling me, I rubbed my eyes and turned away from the lake. Get a grip, I muttered to myself. It's just the lake, just the night playing tricks on you. But the words felt hollow, even to my own ears. The scream echoed again in my mind, a distant, tortured cry that I couldn't escape. I had heard it so clearly, so unmistakably, that I knew it wasn't some animal or trick of the wind. Someone, or something, had been in pain out there. I closed my eyes, taking in a deep breath, hoping to steady myself. But as I did, I noticed it again, the cold. The air around me had become unnaturally still, and the temperature had dropped so sharply that my breath misted in the air in front of me. It wasn't just a chill from the evening, this was something deeper, more pervasive. The sound of the water lapping against the shore, which I had previously found soothing, now seemed distant, hollow. It echoed too loudly, like an unnatural drumbeat, pulsing with the rhythm of some unseen force. My thoughts raced again. Had the scream been a warning? Should I have left already? Every part of me screamed to pack up and drive back to civilization, away from this place, but something held me there. Something deeper than fear. Was it curiosity? Or was it something else? Something darker that had taken root in my mind the moment I had set foot on the shores of that lake? I stood up abruptly, pacing around the campsite, the shadows of the trees stretching longer with each passing moment. The wind had picked up slightly, rustling the leaves above me, but it wasn't enough to lift the oppressive weight that hung in the air. Every creak of the branches made my heart race, every snap of twigs underfoot sounded too loud in the stillness. I needed to focus. I needed to push past this feeling, but the cold had seeped into my bones, and the unease I felt about staying here, about being so isolated, was building again, stronger now. I couldn't shake the feeling that the lake was watching me, or that something was lurking just beyond the tree-line, waiting for the moment I would let my guard down. There was something in the air, something not quite right, and it was growing, deepening, pulling me into its grip. With a shaky breath, I tried to calm my nerves. It's just the isolation. Just your mind playing tricks. But the air felt heavier, colder. And somewhere, in the distance, I could hear a sound. It wasn't a scream this time. It was something quieter, more sinister. A rustling, faint but distinct, moving through the trees. Not an animal. Not the wind. Something was out there. My heart began to race again as I scanned the shadows around me. Something had changed in the air, something unseen and wrong, and I knew, deep down, that I wasn't alone. I wasn't sure if I should stay. I tried to ignore the creeping sense of dread that clung to me, refusing to let go. I had come here for solitude, for a break from the world, but it was becoming harder to hold on to that feeling. The air around me seemed thick with something I couldn't define. I had to push through it. There was no other choice. If I gave in now, I knew I'd never make it out here, let alone get back to my life. So, I forced myself to focus on the task at hand. I grabbed my fishing rod, its weight familiar in my hands, and walked toward the water's edge. The chill in the air was still there, a constant presence, but I refused to let it stop me. The lake was calm, its surface smooth like glass, reflecting the faint glow of the lantern as I settled beside it. The fishing line sank into the dark water with a soft plunk. For a moment, I felt a strange sense of relief. The rhythmic act of fishing, the tug of the line, had always calmed me before. I focused on the water, trying to push the thoughts of that scream from my mind. But as the minutes passed, the feeling didn't leave. If anything, it was growing stronger. At first, I thought it was just the odd way the light from my lantern played off the surface of the water, making it look almost alive. But no matter how I shifted my position, no matter how I tried to adjust the angle of my gaze, the water felt wrong. The ripples in the lake's surface weren't behaving the way they should. They moved in strange patterns, almost as if the water itself were reacting to my presence. The first time I noticed it, I thought I was imagining things. The surface of the lake shifted, subtly, unnaturally, as though something had brushed against it just beneath the surface. But I had seen no movement, no fish stirring. I chalked it up to my own nerves, to the unsettling atmosphere. But then it happened again. This time, the water rippled in a perfect circle, centered directly around the spot where my fishing line lay. The ripples spread outward, as though something large and unseen had disturbed the water, something that shouldn't have been there. My heart skipped a beat, and I sat up straighter, watching the surface carefully. The circle of ripples expanded, and for a moment, everything was eerily still. The wind had stopped, and the forest seemed to hold its breath again. I felt a cold sweat form on the back of my neck. It wasn't natural. It couldn't be. Just a fish, I muttered to myself, trying to reassure my shaking hands as I gripped the rod tighter. But I knew it wasn't a fish. There were no fish in this part of the lake, not in any real numbers. The locals had warned me. They'd said the lake was cursed, that the fish had all but disappeared. I hadn't believed them, of course. But now, with the ripples still spreading across the surface, I wondered if I had been wrong. I threw out another line, trying to shake off the unease. The sound of the line hitting the water should have been a comfort, but it only seemed to emphasize the unnatural stillness that surrounded me. The water wasn't just still, it was too still. The air, too, felt like it had thickened even further, as if something were holding everything in place. The lake was no longer a body of water, it was a presence, an entity that was aware of me. I could almost feel it watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. I didn't know what the lake wanted, but every inch of me screamed that I wasn't meant to be here. A sudden tug on the fishing line snapped me back to the moment. I pulled, expecting to feel the resistance of a catch. But there was nothing. I reeled it back in, only to find the line completely taut, as if something had gripped it and held it in place beneath the water. No movement, no slack. My hand trembled as I tried to pull harder, but it didn't budge. My heart raced, and panic began to claw at the edges of my thoughts. I was fishing. Just fishing. There was no reason to be afraid. But everything about this moment felt wrong. The air, the water, the very sense of the land beneath my feet, it all felt like a trap. A sudden shudder passed through me as the line jerked again, hard this time, pulling me to the edge of the water. My feet slipped on the muddy shoreline, and I had to brace myself against a rock to avoid falling in. Something was pulling from beneath the surface, something large, something that I couldn't see. I tried to reel it in, but the resistance was too strong. The water seemed to react to me, not just as an obstacle, but as if it were alive, actively resisting my attempts to disturb it. I took a step back, unsure of what to do. Should I keep fighting, or let go of the line before it pulled me in two? As I hesitated, the tugging stopped. The water stilled once again, as if nothing had ever happened. The line hung loose, swaying gently in the calm water. The sound of my breath was loud in my ears as I stared at the line. I should have felt relief. But all I could feel was the weight of the silence pressing down on me again, the sense that something was waiting for me to make the next move. I dropped the rod and took a step back. What the hell was going on here? I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The air, once thick with unease, now felt charged, like a storm waiting to break. I glanced around the campsite, then at the dark expanse of the lake, hoping to ground myself in the familiar. But every time my eyes returned to the water, the unsettling feeling grew. I stood there for a long moment, watching the stillness of the lake. The wind had stopped completely, leaving the surface as smooth and black as glass. Everything felt suspended, as if the world itself had stopped turning just for me. The silence was deafening. It was a silence that pressed in on my ears, louder than any sound. And in the stillness, I began to see it. At first, I thought I was imagining it, nothing more than shadows playing tricks on my tired eyes. But when the movement didn't stop, when it began to form patterns, I knew something was wrong. Something was moving across the surface of the water. At first, it was subtle. A shadow flickering near the shore, shifting with the rhythm of the darkened trees along the bank. But as I watched, it grew more distinct, long, shifting shapes that glided across the water as though they were walking, pacing along its surface, moving in perfect, deliberate strides. There was nothing on the lake. No boat, no animal, nothing that could cause these shadows. And yet, there they were, crossing from one side of the water to the other. The shadows moved in strange patterns, disjointed, like an invisible figure was stepping carefully across the water, leaving no trace of its presence except for the dark shapes that followed. I blinked, hoping to clear my vision, but they didn't vanish. Instead, they grew more pronounced, creeping across the surface in slow, deliberate arcs. The water was perfectly still, but the shadows seemed to ripple and sway as if whatever was casting them was walking through it, its weight pushing down on the water's surface, leaving ghostly trails in its wake. I took a step back, my breath quickening. The shadows didn't move like anything natural. They moved with purpose, each shift, each flicker, deliberate and calculated. No wind, no ripples on the water. Just the shadows moving, and the growing feeling in my gut that I wasn't supposed to be here. The lake wasn't just a body of water, it was alive, watching me, waiting for me to see the truth. I rubbed my eyes, tried to convince myself it was some sort of trick of the light, or maybe some rare optical illusion. But every time I looked back, the shadows were still there, drifting in unnatural patterns across the water. They moved with the precision of a hunter stalking its prey, always with a purpose, never erratic or random. It was as if something, someone, was crossing the water, only invisible to my eyes. And that thought, that realization, sent a chill through me colder than the night air. I tried to focus on something else, anything else. The fire crackled behind me, the lantern flickering weakly against the overwhelming dark. I grabbed for my fishing rod again, trying to distract myself, trying to pretend like everything was fine. But my gaze kept drifting back to the lake. The shadows hadn't stopped. They were still moving across the water, slowly, silently, like a parade of figures that I couldn't see but knew were there. I wasn't imagining it. The lake was alive. And it wasn't just the water, it was the air, the land, the very silence that clung to this place like a curse. Everything was wrong. I was wrong to stay. I was wrong to think that just by casting a line into the water, I could escape whatever presence was here, whatever force was pulling me deeper into its grasp. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. Something held me here, something deeper than fear, a pull that was growing stronger the longer I stood on the edge of the water. My breath hitched as the shadows moved again, crossing the water from one side to the other with slow, deliberate steps. They were close now, just beyond the reach of the lantern's light, moving in the direction of the trees where I had set up camp. I took another step back, but my legs felt heavy, like they were made of stone. I wanted to turn and run, to pack everything up and leave this cursed place behind. but no matter how much I willed my feet to move, they wouldn't. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the shadows stopped. The water was still once more. The ripples faded. The night fell silent again. But the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, lingered, settling deep into my chest like a weight I couldn't shake off. I didn't know what to do, didn't know it was real anymore. The lake had shown me something, or perhaps it had shown me nothing at all. But in that moment, I realized that it wasn't about what I could see. It was about what was unseen, what was waiting in the shadows, what had been here long before me and would remain long after I left. The water had tasted my fear, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was only just getting started. I wanted to run, but my body refused. I was trapped in a place that didn't belong to me. The shadows were still out there, and they were getting closer. I don't know when it started, or how long I had been listening to the faint murmur of voices. At first, I thought it was the wind rustling through the branches of the trees or the distant sound of animals stirring in the underbrush. But as the minutes stretched on, the voices grew clearer, sharper. And they weren't the sounds of animals. They weren't the wind. They were whispers. I couldn't make out the words at first, just the faint echo of something that seemed to slip in and out of my hearing, like a half-remembered dream. I tried to focus on them, tried to make sense of what was being said, but no matter how hard I strained, the voices always eluded me. It was as though they were coming from all around me, hovering in the air, slipping between the trees, faint, distant, and utterly unnerving. I told myself it was nothing. A trick of the night. A mix of the wind and my imagination running wild. This place, this lake, it had a reputation for making people hear things, for distorting reality, bending it in ways that were hard to understand. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that the voices weren't just in my head. They were real. For a long time, I tried to ignore them, convinced that I was just letting my nerves get the best of me. After all, I was alone in the woods at night, far from the familiar sounds of home. The cracking of branches, the rustling of leaves, even the occasional howl of a distant animal, all of it added to the atmosphere. But these voices, they were different. They carried with them a weight, a sense of something ancient, something that didn't belong. They weren't just noises, they were calls. Calling to me. I stood by the water, my hands gripping the edge of the dock so tightly that my knuckles ached. The whispers seemed to come from the lake itself, echoing over the water like a gentle tide. It was as if the lake was speaking to me, pulling at something deep inside, something that I couldn't fully comprehend. The voices were soft, barely audible, but I could hear them clearly now. They sounded like people, like a crowd, murmuring just out of reach. Come closer. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Had I heard that? Was that part of the whisper, or was it a voice of my own making? I strained my ears, but the voices were still too faint, slipping away before I could get a firm hold on them. Stay. The words seemed to float on the breeze, curling into my thoughts, and for a brief moment, I felt an urge to do exactly what they asked. To stay. To step closer to the edge of the water. The thought scared me, but it also felt like it wasn't entirely my own. It was as if the lake was pulling at something buried deep inside me, something dark and hidden. I shook my head, trying to clear my mind. I couldn't listen to it. Couldn't give in. This was madness. I wasn't going to be one of those people who got lured by some unseen force, some strange, unknown thing in the dark. But no matter how hard I tried to shake it off, the pull was still there, tugging at the edges of my mind. Come. The voice was clearer now, more insistent. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a command. A pleading, desperate call that came from the depths of the lake, from somewhere just beyond the reach of my understanding. It was almost as if the water itself was calling my name. I took a shaky breath, trying to steady myself. This couldn't be happening. It had to be the wind, or my imagination running wild after too much time alone in the dark. But the feeling in my gut, the ice-cold weight pressing against my chest, told me it was something more. I was not alone. Something else was here with me. I forced my gaze away from the water, unwilling to let myself fall deeper into whatever this was. I stepped back from the edge, my heart pounding in my chest, my breathing shallow. The voices, though, didn't stop. They grew louder now, not just one voice, but a chorus of them, all murmuring, whispering, calling. The words were indistinct, fragments of sentences that sent chills down my spine. Stay, come, we're waiting. I felt my stomach twist. The voices weren't just calling to me anymore. They were calling to something else. Something that was already here. Something I couldn't see. I turned around, scanning the campsite, half expecting to see someone standing just behind me, watching. But there was nothing. No one. The shadows were still, the fire crackling softly in the night air. I was alone. Or at least, I thought I was. Leave. It was a single word, sharp and cold, cutting through the murmurs like a knife. I froze, my feet rooted to the ground, as the word echoed in my ears, louder than any whisper before it. This wasn't just a call to stay, it was a command, a warning. Something was telling me to leave, to get out of here before it was too late. But the question now was, how could I leave? How could I escape this place when it felt like the very earth beneath my feet was holding me here, trapping me in its grip? The whispers continued, insistent, now joined by a low, guttural sound from deep within the forest. A growl, maybe? It was hard to tell. But the sound felt like it was coming closer, growing louder with each passing second. I had to leave. I had to get away from the water, from the voices, from whatever was calling to me. But my legs wouldn't move. My body refused to cooperate, as though something was stopping me, holding me here in the middle of the night, in the heart of the darkness. The whispers filled my mind, drowning out everything else. They were coming for me. And no matter how much I wanted to escape, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was already too late. The night stretched on endlessly, and with every passing minute, the weight of the darkness pressed harder against me. I sat by the fire, the flames flickering weakly in the cool night air, casting long shadows that danced erratically across the ground. But no matter how much I tried to focus on the fire, I couldn't escape the feeling that someone, was watching me. I glanced at the water again. The shadows had disappeared, and the lake lay still, calm, almost serene. But I knew better. The stillness was a lie. There was a tension in the air, a feeling that something was just beneath the surface, lurking, waiting. The air felt thick with it, as though the very atmosphere was saturated with an ancient presence that was never truly gone. My breath came in shallow, quick bursts, the cold air biting at my skin as I pulled my jacket tighter around me. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't leave either. Not anymore. The whispers had stopped, but the air around me still crackled with the energy of their words, their presence. I could almost feel their echoes vibrating through my bones, still lingering in the space where they had been. And now, in the silence that followed, I felt the weight of it all pressing down on me even harder. I wasn't alone. I knew it. I could feel the eyes on me, even though I couldn't see anyone. I stared at the lake, my mind racing. What were the shadows? What were the voices? My mind churned with half-formed thoughts, trying to rationalize what had happened. There had to be an explanation. A reasonable one. Maybe I was just imagining things. Maybe the fear was getting to me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The lake wasn't just some body of water. It was something else. Something ancient. Something that had always been here, waiting for someone like me to come along, to disturb its peace, to awaken it from its slumber. The fire crackled again, but the sound felt distant, muffled, as if I were hearing it from far away. The night had taken on a strange quality, the kind where nothing felt quite real, where everything seemed to be shifting, warping in and out of focus. My senses were on edge, my eyes darting to every corner of the campsite, expecting something to leap out from the darkness. My skin tingled, every hair on my body standing on end. The shadows between the trees seemed to deepen, stretching out like long fingers, reaching for me. I wanted to call out, to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The fear had stolen my voice, leaving me mute, paralyzed by whatever unseen force was slowly tightening its grip around me. The lake, the trees, even the ground beneath my feet, all of it seemed to be alive, watching me, waiting for me to make a move, to give in to the terror that gnawed at the edges of my mind. And then, the first sound came. A soft rustle, like the brush of leaves, but so faint that I almost convinced myself I hadn't heard it. But then it came again, closer this time. I stiffened, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was something else, something too deliberate, too purposeful. Another rustle. And then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching softly in the underbrush, just beyond the reach of my campfire's light. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I turned my head, straining to see, but the darkness was too thick, swallowing everything. The footsteps stopped, but I could still feel them, the weight of the presence out there, just out of sight, just behind the veil of night. I was no longer alone. The panic rose in my chest, sharp and suffocating. I tried to stand, to move, but my legs felt like lead. I wanted to flee, to get in my truck and drive far away from this cursed place, but the fear had me rooted to the spot, trapped in my own body, unable to move, unable to escape. And then it came. A voice. Low, guttural, and unmistakable. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was a growl, an animalistic sound that rumbled from the darkness, sending a fresh wave of terror crashing over me. Leave. The word was clear. Sharp. Commanding. And in that moment, I realized something horrifying. It wasn't just the lake. It wasn't just the shadows. There was something out there, in the trees, in the dark, that didn't want me here. Something ancient. Something hungry. The fire crackled again, casting long, wavering shadows. But now, the shadows seemed to move on their own, as if they were no longer mere reflections of the flames, but something alive, something sentient. My eyes darted to the tree line, my breath coming in ragged. Gasps. I couldn't see it, whatever it was, but I could feel it, closing in, creeping closer with every passing second. The voice came again, louder this time, the growl deepening into something more monstrous. Leave, or stay and suffer. I didn't think. I didn't have time to think. My body moved on its own, and before I knew it, I was stumbling away from the campsite, my legs shaky, my mind spinning. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. I just had to get away. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how far I tried to go, I couldn't escape the feeling of being hunted. The eyes in the darkness were on me, following me, and no matter how far I ran, no matter how much I wanted to scream, there was only one thing I knew for certain. I wasn't going to make it out of here. Not without something following me. Something that had already claimed the lake, and now it wanted me too. I woke up the next morning with the lingering taste of fear still thick in my mouth, as though it had seeped into my very bones while I slept. Or maybe I hadn't slept at all. How could I, after the night I had? My body was exhausted, but my mind raced, replaying the terror over and over. The whispers. The footsteps. The voice. The feeling that something had been waiting for me in the darkness, watching me, listening. But as the first light of dawn pierced through the canopy above, something even worse began to settle in. Silence. There were no birds calling. No rustling of the wind through the trees. No distant calls of wildlife. Not even the soft buzz of insects. Just an eerie stillness that hung heavy in the air, thick as fog. The world around me had gone completely silent. I sat up, my back stiff with tension, scanning the campsite. The trees loomed tall and silent, their branches frozen in place. The lake, usually alive with the gentle ripples of the water, was unnervingly still, its surface like glass, reflecting the dull gray sky overhead. It was as though time itself had paused, leaving me stranded in a moment that felt both endless and suffocating. For a long time, I just sat there, unable to move, unable to tear my eyes away from the stillness. The silence wasn't normal. It wasn't peaceful. It felt unnatural, wrong. The absence of sound was oppressive, a constant pressure against my eardrums, urging me to make noise, to break it, but I couldn't. Every little sound felt out of place, like a betrayal to the quiet that surrounded me. The lake. The trees. Everything seemed suspended in some kind of stasis, as though they were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. And that was the most unsettling part. Waiting for what? What was about to break the silence? What was just out of sight, hidden in the stillness, watching me from the shadows? I forced myself to move, to stand up and stretch my stiff legs. But the moment I did, the weight of the silence grew heavier. The air felt thick, like I was walking through water, every step a struggle. My mind raced with possibilities. Had the voices stopped because the thing that had been calling to me had left? Or was it just waiting for the right moment to strike again? I tried to shake off the creeping dread, but it clung to me like a second skin. The silence wasn't just a lack of noise, it was a presence. It was something that pressed in from all sides, wrapping itself around me until I could hardly breathe. I glanced at my watch, barely 7 in the morning, but the lake's oppressive quiet made it feel like a time of day that shouldn't exist. Not yet. The hours before dawn were supposed to be alive with the sounds of the world waking up. But here, there was nothing. The lake and the woods seemed trapped in a moment outside of time. I had to leave. I had to get out of here, away from this suffocating silence. But the thought of returning to the truck, to the road that had led me here, filled me with dread. What if I wasn't alone? What if the thing that had been calling to me hadn't gone away? The silence had become a barrier, a wall between me and everything I knew. I could feel it, deep down, something was wrong, and the longer I stayed, the more dangerous it would become. I started packing up my things, my movements hurried and clumsy. But with each sound I made, each rustle of my gear, each snap of a twig beneath my boot, I felt like I was defiling the silence, breaking the fragile tension that had settled over the lake. I could almost hear the lake's disapproval, as though it was scolding me for making noise, for disturbing the stillness. I froze again, halfway through zipping up my bag. There it was, the faintest sound, like a breath. A whisper. But it wasn't in my ear this time. It was coming from the lake. A soft ripple in the water broke the surface, spreading out in slow, deliberate waves, though the air was still and windless. The water should have been calm, untouched by anything, but it moved as though something beneath it was stirring. A low, deep movement that seemed to echo from the depths, like the sound of something swimming, something large, something not quite natural. I felt my stomach tighten. It wasn't a fish. It couldn't be. The ripples weren't random, they were purposeful, like someone was dragging something heavy through the water just beneath the surface. My mind raced back to the night before, to the feeling of eyes on me, to the growing sense of being hunted. And just as quickly as the ripples had appeared, they disappeared. The water returned to its unnatural stillness, and the silence came crashing back in. It felt suffocating now, almost unbearable. What was this place? What was it trying to tell me? Why had I come here? I couldn't stay any longer. The thought of the silence, the presence beneath the lake, was enough to drive me mad. I shoved the last of my gear into my pack and made for the truck, my heart pounding as I moved faster than I ever thought I could. The weight of the silence pushed against me, trying to hold me back, but I refused to stop. I had to get away. Had to leave this place behind before whatever was lurking in the lake found its way to the shore. I barely looked back as I drove away, the quiet stretching on behind me, the lake sitting in its unnerving silence, watching me leave. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. It wasn't finished with me. It was just waiting for the next time I was foolish enough to return. I couldn't shake the feeling that the lake was not the true source of the terror. It wasn't just the water, the quiet, or the voices, it was the entire land around it. Something in the earth itself felt wrong, as if the very ground beneath my feet had been warped by something dark, something ancient. I didn't understand it, but I had to find out. Maybe if I could make sense of it, I could escape the grip it had on me. Maybe if I ventured deeper into the woods, I would find some clue, some explanation that would let me walk away from this nightmare. So, I did the only thing that seemed to make sense in the madness that was unfolding. I walked deeper into the forest. The trees stood tall and thick, their trunks gnawed with age, their branches twisting into strange, unnatural shapes. The air was dense with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and though the morning sun should have been warming the forest, it felt colder the further I went in. Each step I took seemed to deepen the sense of isolation, the quiet growing even more profound, as though I were walking in a place that no one had touched for centuries. I didn't look back. I couldn't afford to. But as I pressed on, I realized that the forest around me wasn't just silent, it was too silent. The absence of sound was oppressive, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. The stillness felt alive, like it was watching me. I brushed past thick undergrowth, feeling the weight of each step sinking into the spongy earth beneath me. The further I went, the more I felt the ground shifting beneath me, almost as though the forest floor was shifting with my every move. The trees were twisted, their bark dark and cracked, like scars on the earth. Some of them were so large that I couldn't wrap my arms around them. Others were bent at angles, leaning toward each other as if they were whispering secrets in a language I couldn't understand. I tried to convince myself it was just nature, just the oddities of an old forest. But with every turn, every step deeper into the woods, the sense of something watching me grew stronger. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. It was tangible, as though something unseen was trailing me through the underbrush, following my every movement. The forest was growing denser, and the trees were closing in on me. The path, if there ever had been one, had long since disappeared. I was lost. But the disorienting feeling that had crept over me in the campsite was now overwhelming. The woods felt alive in ways I couldn't explain, as though they were shifting around me, pulling me further in. And then I saw something that made my heart stop. Just ahead, in the clearing between the trees, I spotted a figure. For a moment, I thought I was imagining things, just a trick of the light or a shadow playing in the corners of my vision. But no! There it was again. A silhouette, tall and thin, standing motionless in the distance. It looked like a person, but something about it was off, its shape too elongated, its posture too unnatural, like it wasn't quite right, like it didn't belong. I froze. My heart thudded in my chest, the blood rushing to my ears. I had to move. I had to turn around and get out of here, but I couldn't. My feet were glued to the ground. Something about that figure held me there, as if it were calling me, pulling me forward with an invisible force. I forced myself to take a step, then another, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, waiting, watching. And then I noticed something even stranger. The trees around it seemed bent. The branches were twisted in unnatural ways, almost as if they were reaching toward the figure, as though they were caught in its gravitational pull, bending under some invisible weight. The earth beneath the figure was dark, unnaturally so, as though the soil had been disturbed, churned by something other than the wind or the rain. I couldn't breathe. I had to get away, but my legs wouldn't move. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but my feet were rooted to the ground. The figure remained still, but I could feel its presence now, pressing against me, drawing closer in ways I couldn't explain. And then I heard it. A soft rustling, like the sound of leaves brushing against each other, but too deliberate, too controlled. It was as though the trees themselves were speaking, whispering in a language I couldn't comprehend, urging me to come closer. I blinked, and when my eyes opened again, the figure was gone. The clearing was empty. The trees stood silently, their branches now perfectly still. But the sense of unease, the weight of being watched, was more oppressive than ever. I turned around, not daring to look behind me, and began to walk back, faster now, my heart pounding in my chest. The quiet seemed to close in on me, pushing against me from all sides. The air felt thick, suffocating, as though the forest itself was trying to swallow me whole. I didn't dare look back. But as I moved through the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, that whatever I had seen out there in the clearing wasn't gone at all. It was still there, watching, waiting, just beyond the trees. And now, the silence had become even more suffocating. I couldn't hear the rustle of the leaves or the crack of a branch beneath my feet. All I could hear was my own ragged breath, the sound of my heart thumping in my chest. I was no longer alone in the woods. Whatever had been lurking in the shadows had found me. My legs ached as I pushed through the dense underbrush, the thick trees seeming to close in tighter with each step. The deeper I ventured into the forest, the more the unsettling feeling grew, a weight on my chest, a whisper at the back of my mind that I couldn't shake. It was like something was always just out of sight, waiting, following my every movement. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, a maze of twisted branches and thick shadows that made it impossible to get a clear sense of direction. But it wasn't just the oppressive atmosphere that bothered me now. It was the signs, the unsettling evidence that I wasn't the first to be here, that I wasn't the only one wandering these woods. I spotted the first clue about 30 minutes into my walk. At first, I thought it was just an old fishing rod left carelessly behind by a local fisherman. But as I got closer, I realized it was more than just abandoned gear. The rod was tangled in thick vines, its line wrapped around the trunk of a tree, as if someone had tried to leave it behind in a hurry. The reel was covered in a strange substance, dark, sticky, almost like tar, and it looked as if it had been there for much longer than it should have been. The bait was long gone, but the entire setup had a forgotten, disturbed feel to it, as though someone had intended to come back but never did. I couldn't explain why, but something about it made my skin crawl. It didn't feel like a normal abandoned spot. It felt wrong, as though it had been left in haste, abandoned by someone who had realized too late that the lake wasn't just dangerous, but alive in ways they didn't understand. I moved past it quickly, hoping the feeling of unease would subside. But it only grew. A few yards further, I came across another sign, this one more obvious. Carved into the trunk of a large oak tree was a symbol. It was crude, the marks jagged and uneven, but unmistakable. A circle with lines radiating outward, like an eye staring at me from the tree itself. I could feel my pulse quicken as I stared at it. It was the same symbol I'd seen, vaguely, in a few of the local stories the people at the diner had whispered about, the ones that had been quick to laugh it off, but nervous all the same. They called it a mark of warning, a sign that something dangerous lurked nearby. I reached out and touched the carving, my fingers brushing against the rough bark. It was fresh, still slightly damp. My mind raced. Who had done this? And more importantly, why? I pulled my hand away, my thoughts running in frantic circles. The symbol had been carved intentionally, and it was meant to ward off people, to tell them not to come closer. But why? What was it trying to keep out? Or perhaps, what was it trying to keep in? I felt the weight of the silence pressing down on me again, thick and suffocating, and I quickly turned away from the tree, trying to push the thoughts from my mind. But as I continued forward, the sense that something was watching me, studying my every movement, grew stronger. I stumbled over something hard and unnatural, another sign, this one more disturbing than the last. Half hidden in a pile of leaves and dirt, I found a fishing lure. It was the kind used by professionals, the kind with the reflective scales that gleamed in the sun. But this one was old, chipped and rusted, its hooks torn and twisted. As I knelt down to inspect it, my heart skipped a beat. There was something etched into the metal. Something faint, something so worn by time that it almost blended into the surface. But I could make it out, another symbol. The same circular design, this time smaller, almost like a brand, with several lines crossing through the center. My stomach turned. The fact that it was here, buried under a layer of dirt and leaves, made me realize that this had been placed intentionally, as though someone had gone out of their way to hide it. And the symbols I had now seen multiple times, made it clear that whatever was going on here, it wasn't just superstition. Someone had left these clues, these marks, deliberately. I glanced over my shoulder, a chill creeping down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, something, had been watching me for much longer than I had realized. A shadow, always just out of reach, following me since I first set foot near the lake. The unease that had begun as a subtle whisper was now a constant, gnawing presence at the back of my mind, and the forest around me felt like a trap closing in. Every step felt heavier now, as if the ground beneath me was resisting my every movement, pulling me deeper into the heart of the woods. I had to get out. I had to leave. But I couldn't. The path had long since disappeared, and I was now lost among the trees, each one like a towering sentinel watching my every move. The feeling of being followed intensified, and when I paused to listen, the silence around me felt even more suffocating than before. The air had become thick, almost sticky, as though it was pressing against me from all sides. I kept walking, hoping to find a way out, but as I moved deeper into the forest, I felt it. Something was there. Something just beyond my reach. Something that wasn't human. The feeling wasn't just an instinct anymore, it was a certainty. And then I heard it, a distant rustling, a crack of a twig breaking, followed by a soft, guttural sound. It was faint, but unmistakable. Something, or someone, was close. Too close. I froze in place, my breath catching in my throat, my senses on high alert. I strained to listen, my heart pounding in my chest, but the sound stopped as quickly as it had started. And then came the whisper. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there, right behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know that I wasn't alone anymore. I had to calm down. I had to pull myself together. I was lost, but I wasn't crazy. There were logical explanations for everything. The symbols, the abandoned fishing gear, the whispers, these were just the oddities of an old, isolated place. Maybe the local fishermen had left their gear behind. Maybe the carvings on the trees were just some old markings, a strange but harmless tradition. And the rustling noises? Maybe just animals, moving in the underbrush, reacting to my presence. It was easy to let my imagination run wild while I was alone in the woods. But no matter how many times I tried to reason with myself, the doubt didn't go away. The strange sensation of being watched still clung to me, suffocating me. The whispers kept echoing in my mind, the rustling and creaking trees playing tricks on me. I had to get a grip. I had to stop thinking about the lake as if it were some kind of sentient being, because that was nonsense. Still, the longer I stayed in these woods, the harder it became to dismiss the strange occurrences as mere coincidence. I couldn't ignore the knot that had formed in my stomach, the way the silence around me felt wrong, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. I paused for a moment, taking in my surroundings. The trees were thick and imposing, but they didn't feel like trees anymore. They were too still, too unnatural. It was as though they were watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. A wave of dizziness washed over me. I blinked, shook my head, and forced myself to take a deep breath. I was fine. I had to be fine. There had to be a reasonable explanation for everything. The lake was just a lake. The old stories were just that, stories, nothing more. Superstitions born from the fear of the unknown. People out here weren't used to the isolation, the long stretches of quiet that could make anyone's mind wander. There was no reason to believe that the lake was alive. The whispers, the strange symbols, the abandoned fishing gear, all of it could be explained. I was letting fear cloud my judgment. I turned my back on the trees with the carvings and started to walk in the opposite direction. I wasn't going to let whatever this was get to me. I had to stay focused, find my way back to camp, and leave this place behind. But as I walked, the quiet pressed in on me. It was heavier now, suffocating. Every crackle of a leaf, every snap of a twig underfoot sounded too loud in the silence, as though the woods were amplifying every noise I made. I needed to get out of here, but a part of me, something deep inside me, was afraid to go back to the lake. I couldn't understand why, but that irrational fear was there. It was as though something about the lake, about the land itself, was pulling me in. The sense of being followed, the whispers, the unnatural stillness, It all pointed to something far more sinister than I had been willing to admit. But still, I couldn't let myself believe that. The lake wasn't alive. It couldn't be. I laughed softly, trying to shake off the chill creeping up my spine. This is insane, I muttered to myself. This is all just a product of too much isolation, too much time alone in the woods. Nothing here can hurt me. It's all just in my head. I paused, looking around again, hoping for some kind of reassurance. But all I saw was more trees, more emptiness. The sense of rawness hadn't gone away. It was still there, lingering in the air like a dark cloud that refused to disperse. I swallowed hard and tried to steady my breathing. I knew I needed to push through this. I couldn't let fear win. If I kept questioning myself like this, if I let the idea of the lake being alive take root in my mind, I'd never escape this place. I'd lose my sanity in the process. The rustling came again. Faint, but distinct. Closer now. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. There was no wind. Nothing. The trees stood motionless, their branches heavy and still. I turned slowly, expecting to see something, someone, anything. But there was nothing. The forest was silent once more. I cursed under my breath, my skin prickling with unease. Get a grip. You're fine. It's nothing. But as the silence settled around me, the weight of it became more suffocating. I was beginning to feel like I was no longer walking through the forest, but through something else entirely, a place where the rules of reality didn't apply. I shook my head again, trying to snap myself out of it. There was nothing out here but trees, leaves, dirt. No voices, no eyes watching me, no creatures lurking in the shadows. Just the woods. I had to keep moving. I had to keep walking, or I might lose myself in the madness of it all. I walked faster now, my footsteps quick and loud in the empty stillness. The rustling came again, closer, but I refused to turn around this time. I was being foolish. If I ignored it, maybe it would go away. I was not about to give in to fear. I reached out and touched the rough bark of a nearby tree, grounding myself in the feeling of something solid. It was just a tree. Nothing more. Just a part of the forest. But as my fingers brushed against the bark, I heard something else. This time, it wasn't a rustling, a whisper, or a crack. It was a sound I could never have imagined, a low, guttural hum, like a voice vibrating in the air, deep and unsettling. It wasn't coming from the trees, and it wasn't coming from anywhere I could pinpoint. I froze. It was coming from the ground beneath me. I wasn't imagining this. I wasn't crazy. Something was happening here. Something I couldn't explain. And no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, the truth was unavoidable. The lake was alive. I couldn't breathe. The air around me felt thick, like it was pressing down on my chest, forcing the oxygen from my lungs. My heart raced, and every instinct screamed at me to run, to flee back to the campsite, to get as far away from this place as possible. But the sound, the scream, had echoed in my mind again. A horrible, gut-wrenching scream. It was different this time. It wasn't distant, fading off in the distance like before. No, this one was closer, sharp and raw, tearing through the silence with an intensity that made my stomach turn. I turned my head instinctively, but there was nothing to see. No figure lurking in the trees, no movement in the thick forest around me. Just the silent, oppressive weight of the woods pressing down, suffocating everything in its path. But the scream, God, the scream, was there again, louder now, as though it were coming from the very earth beneath my feet. It was not human. It couldn't be. I felt my pulse quicken, my legs trembling, but I stood frozen, unwilling to let myself run. I wasn't going to fall victim to panic. Not yet. I wasn't going to let fear dictate my actions. But the scream came again, closer, louder, more desperate than before. This time, it was unmistakable. It was a cry of anguish, of pure, unrelenting terror. It sent a chill down my spine that I couldn't shake, and I staggered back a few steps, eyes darting around in a desperate search for the source. There was nothing. The forest stood still, as if it had swallowed the sound whole. I wasn't imagining this. It was real. The scream, the terror, it was real. Something was happening here, something I couldn't explain, and I could no longer pretend it wasn't. I took a deep breath, forcing my mind to clear. Stay calm. Stay focused. But it was getting harder. The fear, the terror, was crawling up my spine, coiling around my thoughts, squeezing the logic out of my mind. Every step I took felt like I was moving further into some dark, unknown world, one that I wasn't sure I could ever return from. I needed answers. I had to know what was happening. This wasn't just a series of coincidences, a few eerie noises, or some wild stories. No, this was something deeper, something darker. What are you afraid of? I felt the question settle in my mind, the thought twisting around, wrapping itself around my thoughts like a noose. What was I really afraid of? The scream? The whispers? The strange symbols carved into the trees? Or was it the idea that something out here, something in the forest, something in the lake, was real, and that it had been watching me all along? The answer was clear. I was afraid of the truth. I couldn't leave now. I couldn't just walk away from this. The terror had to be confronted, or it would haunt me forever. I had come here for answers, answers to what had happened to those who came before me, answers to the stories that everyone whispered about. And now, standing in the heart of the forest, surrounded by the sounds that didn't belong, I realized that I had to face it. I had to know. The scream came again, this time, so close I felt it in my bones. It was so loud, so piercing, that it made my ears ring, and my entire body flinched at the sound. It was a cry for help, but there was something else in it, something darker. Without thinking, I took a step forward toward the source of the sound. I don't know what pushed me forward. Was it courage? Or madness? But my legs moved on their own, carrying me through the thick underbrush, my feet crunching against the fallen leaves, my breath shallow and quick. Each step felt heavier than the last, and the deeper I ventured into the woods, the more intense the screams became. They reverberated through the trees, like they were coming from all around me, yet I couldn't pinpoint the direction. I reached a clearing in the forest, an area I hadn't seen before. The trees around me seemed to bend inward, as if they were pulling me in, urging me forward. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, but then the scream came again, louder, closer, right behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing. The forest stood still, just as it had been. Then, in the dead silence, the ground beneath my feet shifted. I felt it before I saw it, a tremor, faint but unmistakable, running through the earth, like something moving beneath the surface. The trees groaned, their branches creaking as if they were struggling against an invisible force. And then I heard it again. A voice. It wasn't a scream this time. It was a whisper, a low, guttural whisper, soft but clear. It wasn't coming from the trees, the lake, or the sky. It was coming from beneath me. From the ground. Get out. The words echoed in my mind, but they were not my thoughts. No, this voice was something else, something that didn't belong here. I need to know. The fear surged in my chest again, but it was a different kind of fear now. Not the fear of the unknown, but the fear of knowing. What was beneath me? What was buried in this cursed land? What lay at the heart of the lake, at the heart of this twisted place? I couldn't turn back. I had come too far, and whatever this was, whatever was happening here, I was going to face it. The truth, whatever it was, would be mine to uncover. The voice whispered again, louder this time. Leave now. But it was too late. I had already crossed the line. I don't know when I fell asleep, but when I woke, the world was different. The air in my tent was heavy, thick with a sense of dread that seemed to cling to my skin. The sounds of the forest were gone. There were no birds, no insects. Only silence, the kind that settles deep into your bones and makes you question whether the world outside is still turning. But even that eerie stillness wasn't enough to make me forget the nightmare I had just come out of. It had felt so real, too real. The whispers, the screams, the sound of the water calling to me from the depths of the lake. I was there again, standing at the edge of it, the black water stretching endlessly before me. The air was thick with the same unnatural cold I had felt earlier, but in the dream it was worse. The lake was alive, and it wanted something from me. Something I couldn't understand. The whispers were all around me, a cacophony of voices that blended together, making it impossible to separate one from the other. They all called my name, some soft, others frantic, desperate. Each whisper clawed at my mind, like an itch that couldn't be scratched. Come closer, one of the voices hissed. No! Don't listen, another one cried, the desperation so intense it nearly made my heart stop. I couldn't move. My feet were stuck in the mud, my body paralyzed with fear. The lake seemed to be pulling at me, the water moving on its own, like something was beneath the surface, something huge and hungry. The surface rippled in unnatural ways, as if something large was swimming just below, waiting to surface. Then, I saw it. A figure, dark, indistinct, but unmistakably there. It was moving beneath the water, its presence distorting the surface. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. Its shape shifted in and out of view, like a shadow in the depths. The whispers grew louder, drowning out everything else, filling my ears until I thought my mind would snap. Come to us, the voice murmured, soft and seductively. We are waiting. The ground beneath me shifted, the earth trembling as if in response to the thing in the lake. And that's when I felt it, cold, wet fingers brushing against my skin, the sensation crawling up my legs, wrapping around my ankles, pulling me into the water. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. I fought with everything I had, but the grip of the water tightened. I could feel it pulling me deeper, dragging me into the dark abyss. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst from my chest. No! I jerked awake with a gasp, my body drenched in sweat, my heart hammering in my chest. The nightmare clung to me like a suffocating fog. I sat up quickly, my breathing erratic, my head spinning. The darkness of the tent pressed in on me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there. Watching. Waiting. I reached for the flashlight, my hand shaking as I fumbled with the switch. The beam of light cut through the darkness, and I scanned the tent, the trees outside, the space around me. But there was nothing. Only the quiet night and the feeling that I was no longer alone. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to calm myself. It was just a dream. Just a nightmare. Nothing more. But when I opened them again, I was still in the woods, still near the lake. And the fear, the deep, gnawing fear, was still there, crawling under my skin. It wasn't just a nightmare. The line between what I had dreamed and what was real was beginning to blur. The whispers returned, faint but distinct. I wasn't imagining it. They were there, just outside the tent, as though they were coming from the trees themselves. The same whispers I had heard before, the same voices calling my name, taunting me. I stood up, my legs unsteady, and stumbled toward the door of the tent. I had to know. I had to see. The night outside was unnaturally still, the air thick with the sense of something about to happen. The lake stretched out before me, its surface dark and impenetrable, just as it had been in the dream. The whispers were louder now, closer, surrounding me. I stepped out into the cold, the damp earth sucking at my boots as I walked toward the water. My eyes fixed on the surface, but there was nothing. No figure moving beneath the water. No shadows. No disturbance. But I could feel it. It was watching me. My breath came out in shallow gasps, each step toward the lake a battle against the growing terror in my chest. The closer I got, the more the whispers intensified, until it felt like they were inside my head, filling my thoughts, suffocating me. I stopped at the water's edge, my reflection staring back at me from the surface. But something was wrong with it. The reflection was distorted, warping, as if the water itself was alive, breathing. My face twisted, the edges rippling in ways that didn't make sense. I stepped back, but the water seemed to pull at me, as though it didn't want me to leave. The whispers became a chorus now, all of them speaking at once, their voices a cacophony of madness. "Come," they urged. "Come closer." The water shifted again, and I swore I saw something moving beneath the surface, just a shadow, but large, impossibly large, and closing in on me. I backed away, panic rising in my chest, but the ground beneath my feet seemed to shift, as if the earth itself was buckling under the pressure. My head spun, and I stumbled, my legs weak and unsteady. And then, I heard it again. A scream. It was far off, but it was close enough to make my blood run cold. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't. I turned and ran, the sound of my feet hitting the earth drowned by the loud, mocking whispers that followed me, echoing in my mind long after I had fled the water's edge. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. The lake wasn't finished with me. It would never be finished. It had already begun to claim me. I didn't go back to the campsite right away. I couldn't. The fear still gripped me, making every step feel heavier than the last. I wandered aimlessly through the woods, the chill of the night sinking into my bones, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't shake. The nightmare. The whispers. The lake. It was all starting to blur together. I couldn't trust what I had seen, but I couldn't dismiss it either. Something was wrong here, something unnatural, and it was pulling me closer. I needed a distraction. I needed someone to tell me that I was just imagining things, that this was just some strange, isolated place with a few bizarre coincidences. I needed to believe that everything I had experienced so far was nothing more than the product of my own exhaustion and fear. As I wandered, lost in thought, I heard the distant sound of a motor. A boat engine. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but the noise grew louder, more distinct. I turned, straining to see through the thick trees, and caught sight of a small boat gliding across the lake, its motor cutting through the stillness. I didn't know why I felt compelled to approach. Maybe I thought I could ask the fisherman some questions, hear a rational explanation for the strange events that had been haunting me. I moved toward the water, pushing through the underbrush, my mind still fogged with confusion. The boat came closer, and I could see the man in the driver's seat, a middle-aged fisherman, his weathered face hard and expressionless, his hand steady on the motor. He didn't seem to notice me at first, but as he neared the shore, he slowed the boat and turned to look. Our eyes met for a moment, and I saw something in his gaze, something wary, almost fearful. His lips tightened into a grim line, and he looked around quickly, as though making sure he wasn't being watched. He cut the motor, and the boat drifted quietly to the shore. I hesitated, unsure of what to say, but he spoke first, his voice low and rough. "You shouldn't be here." The words hit me harder than I expected. They were simple, but the weight behind them was enough to send a shiver down my spine. I started, but the man didn't wait for me to finish. "Listen," he said, his eyes scanning the shore as though he were afraid someone might be listening. "I've been fishing these waters for years. Longer than most folks around here. But you've been warned, this lake, this place, it's bad news. People disappear around here. Always have, always will." I blinked, confused. "Disappear?" He nodded grimly, his eyes narrowing as he leaned closer. "It ain't like anything you've heard in the stories. It's worse. Much worse." His gaze flicked nervously toward the trees, and for a moment I thought he was going to say more. But instead, he shook his head. "The lake has a hold on people," he continued, his voice quiet, as if he was afraid of being overheard. "It draws them in. At first, it's just whispers, things you can't explain. Then you hear things, noises, screams, voices, like it's calling to you. And before you know it, you're so deep in its grip that you can't leave. Some folks think it's just superstition, but I've seen it with my own eyes. Good people, they go missing, and the lake keeps them." I frowned, feeling a chill creep up my spine. "You mean they drown?" He shook his head, his face hardening. "Not like that. Not always. Some of them never come back at all. You find their things, their gear, maybe their boat, but not them. No one knows what happens. But it's always the same, no matter who you ask. The lake takes them. And it don't let go. Ever." I swallowed, the weight of his words sinking in. I had heard whispers from locals before, warnings about the lake, about its strange pull, but hearing it from someone who had lived and worked here for so long made it harder to dismiss. Something was happening here. Something dark. "Why haven't you left?" I asked before I could stop myself. The fisherman's lips twisted into a half-smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm not the one it wants. It only takes the ones who don't listen." His gaze flicked to the water, and for a moment his face seemed to soften with a kind of distant sadness. "Some people think it's the water, the curse of the land, but I don't know. I've been here too long to try to make sense of it. I just know that when the lake calls, you don't answer." I opened my mouth to ask more, but he held up a hand, silencing me. "Do yourself a favor," he said, his voice low but urgent. "Go back to your car. Leave. There's nothing good for you here." I stared at him, a mix of disbelief and fear churning inside me. I wanted to ask him about the screams I had heard, about the strange things I had seen, but the look in his eyes told me he wouldn't answer. He had seen it, and it had broken him. Whatever this was, whatever the lake held, it was too much for him to talk about. Without another word, he revved the motor, and the boat pulled away from the shore, moving swiftly toward the far end of the lake. I stood there, watching him go, the weight of his words lingering in the air. I wanted to shake them off, to laugh them off as paranoia, but I couldn't. The air felt too heavy, too thick with warning. The fisherman was right about one thing. There was something about this place, something I couldn't explain. But now I was too deep in, and I had already crossed the line. I couldn't leave. Not yet. Not before I knew the truth. The boat faded into the distance, leaving me standing on the edge of the lake, the surface now eerily calm. The fisherman's words echoed in my mind, his warning clinging to me like the damp air that surrounded me. But something deeper inside me refused to be swayed. There was no turning back. I couldn't just leave, not without facing whatever this was. The lake had already claimed a part of me, and the more I tried to deny it, the more I felt like I was losing myself to it. The fear I felt earlier hadn't faded. In fact, it had only grown stronger, feeding off my uncertainty and doubt. But beneath it all, there was something else. A kind of determination, a desire to know the truth, to understand why this place was so wrong. I had to know what the lake was hiding, what secret it kept so tightly bound in its dark depths. And, if it was my fate to be consumed by it, I wanted to face that fate head on. I had to know what it was that drew people in, what it was that made them disappear. The moon hung low in the sky, casting pale light over the water, making the surface glisten in a way that seemed almost unnatural. There were no stars tonight, the sky thick with clouds that hung like a heavy shroud over the land. It was as though the world itself had fallen still, waiting for something. Or maybe it was just me, waiting. I stepped toward the water, the sound of my boots sinking into the soft earth beneath me. The whispers were gone now, but I could feel their presence lingering in the back of my mind, like a constant hum beneath everything I did. The lake was watching. I could feel it in the air, in the very atmosphere around me, like a pressure that grew stronger with every step. I reached the water's edge, the same spot I had stood at before. The surface was still, undisturbed, as though nothing had happened. But I knew better now. I knew what was lurking beneath, waiting, just out of sight. My heartbeat quickened, but I didn't falter. I had to see it. I had to confront whatever was in the depths. I knelt down at the water's edge, my hands shaking as I touched the cool surface. The lake was deceptively calm, like a smooth sheet of glass, but I knew the truth now. Beneath it, something stirred. Something ancient and dangerous. The air grew colder, the wind picking up slightly, making the trees around me rustle. The quiet of the night was deafening, broken only by the occasional lapping of water against the shore. My breath came out in visible clouds, the temperature dropping with each passing second. I could feel the presence again, stronger now, as though the lake itself had awakened. I stood and took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "Come on," I muttered under my breath. "Show yourself." At first, nothing happened. The water remained still, its surface reflecting the moonlight in eerie silence. But then I saw it. A ripple. A slight disturbance, barely noticeable at first. It was subtle, but it was enough. Something moved beneath the water, something large, something that shouldn't be there. The ripple spread outward in concentric circles, but there was no wind to explain it. No boat, no animal stirring beneath the surface. I took a step back, my pulse racing, but I forced myself to stay. I had to see it. I had to know what it was. The water began to churn, the surface writhing like something was struggling beneath it. I could hear faint sounds, low, muffled, like something was scraping against the rocks beneath the water. Then, the whispers returned, louder this time, filling my ears with their frantic urgency. They weren't distant anymore. They were all around me, so close I could almost feel their breath on my neck. The surface of the water bulged, as though something was rising from below. The moonlight glinted off the edges of something dark, large, and undulating beneath the surface. It was hard to make out, but I saw it, just for a moment, a long, sinuous shape moving slowly beneath the water. I froze. My mind screamed at me to run, to turn and get away, but I couldn't move. My body was rooted to the spot, unable to tear its eyes away from the lake. The shape moved again, and this time I saw it more clearly. It was long, impossibly long, and it twisted beneath the surface like a serpent. The water rippled and shifted in unnatural ways, the creature moving just beneath, its form shifting and distorting as it slid through the lake. I felt my breath catch in my throat. This wasn't just a fish or an animal. This was something else. Something ancient. And it was looking at me. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, the voices overlapping each other, all calling to me, begging me to come closer. The water stirred violently now, the creature rising to the surface in a slow, deliberate motion. It was massive, its body undulating with unnatural grace, its shape barely discernible in the moonlight. But I could feel it, feel its presence, feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see its face. I backed away, panic rising in my chest, but I was still drawn to it. The lake held me in its grip, and no matter how hard I tried to resist, I couldn't look away. The creature surfaced completely, its massive form breaking through the water with a violent splash. It was like nothing I had ever seen. Part of it resembled something animalistic, something reptilian, maybe, but it was impossible to describe. Its body was slick and dark, covered in scales that gleamed in the moonlight, and its shape twisted in ways that didn't make sense, like it was both there and not there at the same time. Its eyes, dark and empty, locked onto mine, and for a moment, I felt a surge of cold terror unlike anything I had ever experienced. I turned and ran, not caring where I was going, not caring about anything except the desperate need to escape. But as I fled, I knew one thing for sure, the lake hadn't shown me everything yet. This was only the beginning. And it was already too late to leave. The lake had me now. And it wouldn't let go. The terror of what I had just witnessed, the massive, serpentine creature rising from the water, stayed with me like a weight on my chest, but I refused to let it consume me. I couldn't leave. Not yet. The need to understand, to confront whatever was buried beneath the lake, still gnawed at me. I had to keep going. I couldn't let fear rule me, no matter how much it clawed at the edges of my mind. So, I returned to my campsite. The tent felt like a haven, a small comfort amid the suffocating unease. I grabbed my fishing gear, my hands trembling, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. I knew I couldn't just sit in the safety of the campfire all night, too afraid to step out into the dark again. I had to face it head on. I had to fish. I had to try, even though everything inside me screamed to stay away from the water. The moon hung low, casting long shadows across the campsite as I approached the water's edge again. The surface was unnervingly still, as though the lake was holding its breath. I set up my rod, my hands more steady now, but my mind was far from calm. The whispers were still there, faint and almost imperceptible, but they lingered like a shadow in my thoughts. I cast my line into the water, the sound of the splash cutting through the silence. But as soon as the line settled into the lake, something changed. A subtle shift. The air grew thick with an oppressive stillness, and the temperature dropped again, colder than before. The whispers grew louder, and I could feel the weight of them pressing in around me, as if the very water itself was calling to me. I tried to ignore it, to focus on the line, but the longer I sat there, the more the world around me began to shift. It was as if reality itself was beginning to fray at the edges, like the calm surface of the lake was a thin veil between this world and something much darker. And then it happened. The water rippled. At first, it was subtle, a slight disturbance, a shifting of the surface. But then it deepened, the ripples growing larger, spreading outward in impossible patterns. The whispers reached a crescendo, now voices clear and distinct. They were no longer a distant hum, they were real, tangible, crawling under my skin. The air seemed to vibrate with their energy, growing heavier, suffocating. I pulled on the rod, trying to focus, but my grip was slipping. The water beneath me began to swirl in unnatural spirals, as though something was moving beneath the surface, pulling everything into a vortex. The line jerked, and I struggled to maintain control, but it was no use. The force pulling at the line was overwhelming. I glanced down into the water, and that's when it happened. The world around me blurred, the edges of reality twisting and warping. The lake was no longer just water, it was alive, a living entity that reached up and grasped at me, its dark depths unfolding in ways I couldn't understand. Figures began to rise from the water, distorted and twisted, their forms shifting in and out of focus. Their faces were obscured, but I could feel their eyes, unblinking and searching. The figures were not human, not in any way I could recognize. Their bodies flowed and twisted like the water itself, part of it, yet separate. They moved in sync with the lake, as if they were born from its depths. There were dozens of them, maybe more, all reaching for me with long, fluid limbs, their features too distorted to make out, but their intent clear. They were coming for me. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest as the world continued to shift around me. The water began to churn violently, the figures pulling at the very fabric of reality. It was as though the lake was trying to swallow me whole, pulling me into its depths. The surface of the water no longer looked like water at all. It had become a swirling mass of shadows and twisted forms, undulating and writhing. I tried to pull the line, to free myself, but my hands were shaking uncontrollably. The figures grew closer, and the water surged, rising up in impossible shapes. I was no longer on solid ground. The water was moving around me, pulling me in, dragging me closer to the center of the lake. My feet slipped, and I fell forward, my hands reaching for something to hold on to. But there was nothing but the cold, dark water and the distorted figures that reached for me with their unnatural, fluid motions. I screamed, my voice swallowed by the roar of the water. My body felt as though it was being pulled apart, twisted by the lake's power. The figures closed in on me, their faces shifting between forms, human, animal, monstrous. They spoke in voices I couldn't understand, a chorus of whispers and screams, all blending together in a maddening cacophony. The line snapped, and everything around me went dark. I was submerged in the lake, pulled under by a force greater than anything I had ever known. My body twisted and contorted, my lungs burning for air, but there was no escape. I was drowning in the water, suffocating in the grip of something ancient and unrelenting. The figures surrounded me, their shapes blending with the water, their faces staring into mine, and I could feel their cold hands on me, dragging me deeper, farther into the abyss. And then, as suddenly as it began, the world snapped back into focus. I was on the shore, my body shaking, gasping for air. My fishing rod was still in my hand, the line trailing in the water. The lake was still. The figures, the water, the twisted reality, it was gone. But the fear remained, a lingering sensation that I couldn't shake. I looked around frantically, searching for any sign of the nightmare I had just witnessed. But there was nothing. Only the stillness of the lake, the quiet, empty woods. It was as if nothing had happened. But I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. The lake was alive, and it was still watching. And I knew, deep down, that it hadn't finished with me yet. The silence that followed was deafening. I lay there on the shore, gasping for air, my chest heaving with the effort to draw in enough oxygen. My hands trembled, fingers curling into the cold earth beneath me as if it were the only thing anchoring me to reality. The water, so still, so calm, mocked me from just a few feet away. But I knew it wasn't over. I stood up shakily, forcing myself to back away from the lake, each step feeling heavier than the last. My body felt strange, light, yet impossibly weighed down, as though the very air was suffocating me. My mind was in chaos, thoughts racing in all directions. But one truth had settled in, crystal clear and undeniable: the lake wasn't finished with me. It had touched me. It had seen me. And now, it wanted me. I stumbled back toward the campsite, the world around me beginning to warp again. It was subtle at first, like a soft flicker at the edges of my vision, but the air itself felt thick, pressing in on me. The sounds of the forest, birds, insects, the occasional rustle of wind had faded to nothing. There was only the lake. The whispers began again, quieter this time, more intimate, as though they were breathing directly into my ear. The voices of the lake were inside me now, a part of me, drawing out the fear and the despair, feeding off it, and I couldn't escape them. My hands trembled uncontrollably as I grabbed my things, trying to make sense of my thoughts, but nothing was clear. The fishing rod was still there, the reel spinning slowly as if it had a mind of its own. I stared at it, and for a fleeting moment, I saw the same unnatural shapes twisting beneath the surface of the water, the figures moving, writhing, waiting. I saw them, felt them, all at once. I couldn't stop shaking. My breath came in ragged gasps, and for a moment, I almost thought I could feel the lake inside me, its cold fingers crawling under my skin, burrowing into my thoughts, sinking deep into the marrow of my bones. It was like a sickness, an infection, creeping through me, slowly taking control. I grabbed my bag, stumbling toward the truck, my heart thumping so loudly in my ears that it almost drowned out the whispers. But the voices didn't stop. They got louder, clearer, until I could hear them speaking directly to me. They weren't speaking words anymore. They were thoughts, suggestions. They pushed and prodded at my mind, urging me to return to the water, to let it claim me, to stop fighting it. I couldn't do it. My head swam with confusion, with the rising sense of dread. The world around me felt wrong. The air felt wrong. The earth beneath my feet felt wrong. I wasn't alone. The lake was here with me, inside me, always there, never letting go. I stumbled toward the truck, but my legs felt like they were made of lead, heavy and uncooperative. My vision blurred, the edges of everything softening and twisting. The moon seemed to stretch unnaturally across the sky, casting strange, jagged shadows that didn't belong. The world was bending, warping, just like the lake itself. Then I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the water, silhouetted against the moonlit surface, its shape vaguely human, but wrong in ways I couldn't understand. It was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed to stretch in unnatural angles. The figure was motionless, just standing there, staring at me with dark, empty eyes. I froze. My body locked in place. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, urging me forward. My fingers twitched as if trying to reach out to it, to connect, to give in. I wanted to move, to run, but I couldn't. I felt rooted to the ground, my mind locked in a battle I couldn't win. The figure stepped forward, slowly, as though the air itself was stretching with it. Each movement was deliberate, methodical, and I could feel my pulse race as it drew closer. Its features remained hidden, obscured by shadows, but there was no mistaking the pull it had on me. I was drawn to it, to the lake behind it, to the thing that had been waiting for me all this time. A cold, numbing sensation washed over me. My body felt like it was made of stone, but the lake's influence was undeniable. It was inside me, wrapping around my thoughts, distorting them, bending them to its will. The figure reached out, its fingers long and skeletal, and I felt the pull of it deep in my chest. Without thinking, I stumbled forward. I couldn't resist anymore. I had to go to the water. I had to let it take me. But as I stepped forward, something snapped inside me. A flash of clarity. The lake wasn't just trying to claim my body, it was trying to claim my mind, my soul. Everything in me screamed to fight it, to push back. The lake was a sickness, a parasite, and it had been feeding on my fear, on my doubt. It was trying to break me, to consume me. I screamed, my voice ragged and broken, as I tried to resist the pull. But the whispers came louder, louder than ever, all around me now, the voices of the lake, of the figures that lurked beneath the surface. They were everywhere, inside me, outside me. I couldn't escape them. My legs gave way, and I collapsed to the ground, hands pressing into the dirt, the weight of the lake's presence pushing me down, holding me in place. I tried to scream, but the sound was caught in my throat, suffocated by the pressure of the water's grip. And then, as I lay there, half conscious, I felt something pull at my mind. Something cold and invasive, creeping through my thoughts, dragging me into the depths. I could feel it taking hold, sinking into me, wrapping around my very soul. It wasn't just the lake, it was the force behind it. The thing that lived within the water, the thing that waited for anyone foolish enough to come near. It was claiming me, and I had no strength left to fight back. The sun had barely risen, casting a pale, gray light across the campsite, but it might as well have been midnight for all the good it did. The shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should have, and the air was thick with the same oppressive weight that had clung to me since the night before. I had spent hours lying awake, unable to escape the feeling that something was waiting. The whispers, the voices, they had never stopped. They were constant, now, running through my thoughts, crawling under my skin, filling the empty spaces of my mind until I couldn't tell where I ended and they began. The lake was still there, just beyond the camp, its surface deceptively calm, as though it were biding its time. I had to leave. I knew it. Every inch of me screamed that I needed to get away from this place, from the lake, from whatever twisted force had its claws in me. But no matter how much I willed myself to move, I couldn't. The moment I tried to stand, the weight of the earth seemed to crush down on me, as though an invisible hand was pressing on my chest, forcing me to remain where I was. My legs wouldn't respond. My feet wouldn't lift. It was like the ground itself had become an extension of the lake, reaching up to hold me in place. I looked toward the truck, only a few feet away. The road beyond it, the promise of escape, was so close, yet impossibly far. Every instinct told me to run, but there was no way. I was trapped, stuck in some unseen grip, unable to move. My breathing became shallow, ragged. The air felt heavier with every passing second, and the voices, soft at first, then clearer, sharper, began to grow again. Stay. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command, pulling at me with a force that rattled my bones. The sound seemed to echo from the very water itself, vibrating through my chest, reverberating in my skull. The lake was calling to me, telling me to stay, to surrender. I stood up, my legs shaking as if they might buckle at any moment, but the moment I took a step, I felt the pull again. This time, stronger. It was like the lake was sending something out, an invisible force, an extension of itself, anchoring me to this cursed spot. I could feel the energy thrumming through the air, almost like an electric charge, pulling at my muscles, binding me in place. The realization hit me then. The lake wasn't just holding me physically. It was inside me. It had been seeping into my mind ever since I first set foot on its shores. The strange visions, the whispers, the nightmares. They weren't just figments of my imagination. They were its tendrils, reaching into me, twisting my perception. I wasn't just stuck in this place, I was being drawn into it, piece by piece. I tried to resist, to fight it off. But the longer I fought, the weaker I became. My thoughts were slow, clouded. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Stay. It was a soft murmur, yet it thundered in my ears. You belong here. I gritted my teeth, clenched my fists, willing myself to move. I had to get out of here. I had to break free. But the harder I tried, the less control I had. My feet felt glued to the ground, and the lake's influence seemed to spread through my body, cold and suffocating. It was like a poison running through my veins, taking away my will, my strength, my very sense of self. Then I saw it. The figure from the night before. The one by the water. It wasn't just standing there. Now it was moving, slowly, purposefully, its long limbs bending unnaturally, stretching toward me. My breath hitched in my throat as I tried to pull away, but my body wouldn't listen. I couldn't move. I couldn't even scream. The figure was closer now, close enough that I could see its face, or what was left of it. There were no eyes, no mouth. Just an empty, gaping space, dark and hollow, as if the very essence of life had been drained from it. It was a reflection of the lake itself, something twisted and unnatural, born from the darkness beneath the surface. I knew then that it wasn't just the lake that had a hold on me. It was the thing beneath the water. The thing that waited for anyone foolish enough to get too close. And I had gotten too close. With what little strength I had left, I tried to push the thought away. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind breaking under the pressure, but deep down, I knew better. This was real. The lake was real. And it had marked me. Stay. The voice was louder now, almost pleading, but there was something dark in it. Something desperate. The figure moved closer, its empty gaze fixed on me. It was close enough now that I could feel the chill radiating from it. The air around me dropped several degrees, my breath clouding in front of me. My skin prickled as the lake's cold fingers slid over my skin, seeping into me, pulling me toward the water. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I couldn't. I couldn't move. The whispers were deafening, the pressure in my chest unbearable. I was no longer sure where the lake ended and I began. Stay with us. And then, just as it seemed I might collapse under the weight of it all, I heard something else. A voice. This time, it wasn't a whisper. It was a cry. A shout. Get out. I turned, desperate, eyes darting around the campsite. Was someone else here? But there was no one. Just the figure by the water, its face still staring at me, its limbs twisting and bending in ways that should have been impossible. Get out. The voice was clearer now, more insistent, and it wasn't just one voice. There were others, distant but growing louder, as though they were calling to me from somewhere deep in the forest. Somewhere I couldn't see. I didn't know if I was hearing things or if it was the last remnants of my sanity trying to break free, but I had to do something. Anything. I couldn't stay. Not here. Not with it. I clenched my fists, dug my heels into the ground, and willed myself forward toward the truck. The air grew thick again, the pressure mounting, but for the first time in what felt like forever, I fought back. With everything I had, I fought. The lake wouldn't claim me. Not today. I took a step, then another, and another. The weight lifted, the grip loosening, and I moved. I ran. The air around me felt colder with each step, the heavy silence pressing in like a suffocating blanket. I ran, desperate, my legs burning from the effort, but every time I glanced over my shoulder, I saw it. The figure. It had been there all along, lurking just beneath the surface of the lake, waiting, watching, but now it was becoming clearer. The figure in the water wasn't just a shape or a shadow. It was something far worse. Something alive. At first, it had been a fleeting movement, a blur in the corner of my vision. But now, as I sprinted toward the truck, the water itself seemed to churn and shift in unnatural ways, as though something immense was stirring beneath. The lake was no longer still. It was alive. It was waking up. I stumbled to a stop, breathless, my heart hammering in my chest as I turned to face it. The figure was moving. It was rising from the depths, pushing through the surface of the water with a slow, deliberate force. The shape was humanoid, tall and gaunt, but its limbs were elongated and twisted, as if they had been stretched beyond their natural limits. The water around it rippled in unnatural, erratic patterns, as though it were trying to escape, to retreat from the figure that had emerged from it. The lake was rejecting it, yet at the same time, it was feeding it. The thing, whatever it was, seemed to grow stronger the more it pushed itself out of the water. Its form was hazy at first, like a fog or mist clinging to the surface, but as it continued to rise, its features began to solidify. The long arms reached out, too long, too thin, almost like tendrils of shadow, stretching toward me with a terrifying, unnatural grace. I could see it more clearly now. Its face, or what was left of it, was not human. It was hollow, the skin stretched taut over a skull that seemed too large, too wide, for any normal creature. Its eyes were black, empty voids, sunken deep into its skull, giving it a haunting, predatory look. But worse than the face was the mouth, if you could even call it that. It was a gaping hole, a cavern of darkness, as though its very being was made of nothing but emptiness, a void that swallowed everything in its path. The thing in the water didn't have a body. Not in the traditional sense. Its form seemed fluid, like smoke or mist, yet solid in a way that defied explanation. It twisted and writhed as it moved, as though it were made from the very essence of the lake itself, an embodiment of its darkness, its power, its malevolent force. I couldn't breathe. My lungs froze, the air thick with fear, the sense that I was standing at the edge of something I could never hope to understand. This wasn't just a creature from the depths. It was the lake, an ancient, malevolent spirit, alive and feeding off the fears of those who dared to come near. The figure reached out, its long, skeletal fingers stretching across the water's surface, the air vibrating with an oppressive force. It was calling to me. I could feel its influence, like an invisible hand tugging at my mind, pulling me toward it, toward the water. The whispers returned, louder now, more insistent. Come closer. Stay with us. Join us in the depths. I tried to move, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. My feet felt like they were glued to the ground. The lake was calling to me, it was calling to me, and I could feel myself being pulled toward it, a thread of my own terror tying me to it. I had to fight it. I had to break free. But the figure, now fully emerged from the lake, was closer. It was rising, towering over me. Its arms stretched out further, and I could see that its fingers were sharp, like claws, reaching for me as though to drag me back into the water with it. I could hear its voice now, not words, exactly, but a resonance, a sound that vibrated through my bones, filling my entire being with a deep, insidious dread. The water, the figure, the whispers, it all connected. They were one. And it wasn't going to let me leave. The lake wasn't just a place. It was a force, an ancient terror that had claimed countless lives, and it had set its sights on me. There was no escaping it. No running from it. I could feel the panic rising inside me. My heart was racing, my breath shallow, but I fought it. I fought the compulsion to step forward, to surrender myself to the thing that called from the water. The figure's face twisted in a grotesque mockery of a smile, and for a split second, I thought I saw something else in the depths of its eyes. Something familiar. Something human. No. I had to break free. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about not becoming one of them. Not letting the lake claim me like it had claimed so many before. The ground beneath me trembled, and I felt the pull of the water becoming stronger. The figure's claws were inches away from me now, its cold breath brushing against my skin. I reached out, my hand grabbing the nearest thing I could find, a branch from a nearby tree, and swung it at the figure. It screamed. A high-pitched, otherworldly wail that seemed to echo from the very depths of the lake, the sound vibrating in the air around me. But the thing didn't retreat. It only smiled. And I realized with a sickening lurch in my stomach, it didn't want me to leave. It didn't want me to escape. I turned and ran. My heart pounded in my chest, and every step felt heavier than the last. The grip of the lake, its presence, was suffocating, pressing in from all sides. The figure in the water was still there, its long arms stretching toward me, but I didn't dare look back. I had to escape. But something was wrong. The world around me was changing. At first, it was subtle, a slight shift in the way the trees leaned, a subtle distortion in the air, as though I were moving through a thick fog. But then, the ground beneath my feet began to feel unsteady, like the very earth was shifting beneath me. I stumbled, trying to steady myself, but the landscape was becoming a maze of unfamiliar shapes and twisted forms. The trees, once tall and steady, now bent at impossible angles. The trunks twisted into spirals that seemed to bend and warp like liquid metal, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, scraping at the sky. The rocks scattered across the ground grew larger, distorting into jagged, unnerving shapes, their surfaces slick and reflective, like they were coated in a thin layer of water that shimmered unnaturally under the dim light. The sky itself was shifting. The once clear blue expanse overhead had become a sickly shade of green, the clouds swirling in unnatural patterns. They seemed to move too fast, spiraling around in a way that defied reason. The sun, which had been just above the horizon, now flickered like a dying light bulb, casting strange shadows that danced erratically across the land. I tried to keep moving, my legs heavy, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts. But the more I ran, the more the surroundings warped around me. The path I had taken seemed to stretch into infinity with no clear direction or end. I was running in circles, unable to escape the nightmare that surrounded me. A chill ran down my spine. It wasn't just the lake anymore, it was everything around me. The world itself was twisting, warping into something otherworldly. Something that didn't belong. I shouted, my voice breaking the silence in a desperate cry. This isn't real. It can't be real. But no matter how loud I yelled, the words felt hollow, swallowed by the disorienting distortion that surrounded me. I tried to focus, to make sense of the madness, but the more I tried, the more the world rejected my logic. The trees leaned closer now, their branches stretching toward me like hands reaching out to grab me. The ground buckled beneath me, and I nearly fell, but I caught myself just in time. And then, from behind, I heard the whispers again. They were louder now, sharper. A chorus of voices, faint but growing clearer, calling out to me from all directions. Come back. Stay with us. You can never leave. I couldn't think. My head felt like it was going to explode from the pressure. I wanted to scream, to fight back, but it felt like I was drowning in the very air around me. The landscape was closing in, the ground buckling beneath my feet, the sky spinning overhead. I had to escape. I had to escape. I turned and ran, forcing my legs to carry me forward, pushing past the distorted trees and rocks. But no matter how fast I ran, I felt like I wasn't getting anywhere. The path ahead never seemed to end, and the more I looked around, the more I saw the warping landscape shifting in time with my movements, as though it were reflecting my every step. The whispers grew louder, the voices more frantic. They were closing in, surrounding me. I could feel them, pressing against my mind, their cold fingers reaching into my thoughts, pulling me down into the depths of the lake with them. I gasped for air, but my lungs felt heavy, as though the very atmosphere was choking me. The world seemed to close in tighter, the trees, the rocks, the sky, all of it folding in on me, warping into shapes that were no longer natural. The lines between reality and illusion had become indistinguishable. And then, I saw it. At the end of the path, at the edge of the lake, the figure from the water stood waiting for me. It was taller now, its form growing ever more grotesque, more monstrous. The sky twisted behind it like a dark, swirling vortex, pulling everything toward it. No, no, no! I turned away, my feet slipping on the warped ground as I tried to run in the opposite direction, but it was no use. The world was falling apart around me, and every path led back to that lake. Every path led back to the figure. I couldn't escape. The lake had me now. It was no longer just a place. It was a prison, a mind-bending labyrinth that would never let me go. I stumbled, my legs giving out beneath me, and I fell to the ground, my hands scraping against the jagged rocks. The voices were deafening now, a cacophony of whispers and screams that rattled my very soul. I couldn't escape. I couldn't think. I was losing myself. And as the figure drew nearer, I realized something with a sickening certainty. The lake wasn't just trying to claim me. It was me. It was in my mind, my thoughts, my every fear. It had always been there, waiting for the moment when I would finally surrender. I had no idea how I was still standing. The air felt heavy, thick with an unnatural pressure. My skin prickled, burning under the weight of its presence. My heart pounded in my chest, but it was a distant sound, almost drowned out by the whispers that clawed at the back of my mind, urging me to give in. But something inside me refused. A spark of defiance. I couldn't let it end like this. I wouldn't let it end like this. Not here, not now. The lake had taken too much already, too many lives, too many souls, and I would be damned if I would add mine to that long, twisted list. I took a step back, my legs shaking, but somehow I kept my balance. The figure in the water moved with impossible speed, its limbs stretching towards me, its claw-like fingers just inches from my face. I could feel the cold, unnatural chill emanating from it, filling my lungs, freezing my blood. "You can't escape," it whispered, its voice reverberating in my bones. "You belong to us. You always have." No. I thought, my mind screaming against its pull. No, I will not be part of this. Not like them. With a primal cry, I swung my arm toward the figure, my hand grabbing the nearest rock. I didn't know why I grabbed it, but it didn't matter. I swung with all the strength I could muster, hitting the dark form in the chest. It was like striking water, soft, yielding, but it made the figure recoil, just for a moment. But that moment was all I needed. I backed away again, my breath ragged, my pulse thundering in my ears. The world around me was still shifting, distorting, but there was a strange clarity in the chaos. I had to break free. I couldn't let it take me. I looked around, my eyes darting, desperately searching for something, anything that could help. The lake. It was the source, the heart of it all. But it wasn't just the water. It was the land itself. The trees, the rocks, the very air. I was trapped in a web of it. I needed to fight back. I needed to sever its hold. Without thinking, I grabbed another rock, larger this time, and hurled it with all my might into the lake. The moment the stone hit the water, the lake seemed to recoil, rippling violently. The whispers around me faltered for a heartbeat. But the lake wasn't done. It wasn't weakened. It was only growing angrier. The ground beneath my feet trembled, and I could feel the air grow colder, sharper. The figure in the water let out a low, guttural sound, like a growl, its face contorting in anger. The claws reached for me again, faster now, and I could hear the splashing of the water as it surged toward me. I backed away, the weight of its presence closing in from all sides. But I knew deep down that I couldn't outrun it. The lake wasn't just a place. It was a force. A malevolent, ancient force that had claimed countless others before me and would claim countless more after. But I'm not ready to die, I thought, a wave of desperation crashing through me. I won't give up. I ran toward the shoreline, my feet slipping in the mud, the eerie glow of the lake reflecting off the surface, casting long, twisting shadows. I could hear the creature behind me, feel its cold fingers brushing against my back, but I didn't look. I couldn't look. The world seemed to close in around me, the trees and rocks distorting, closing in like they were part of the lake's vast, suffocating presence. I reached the edge of the water and jumped back, but the ground beneath me gave way. I slipped, falling to my knees in the mud clutching at my skin, pulling me in. I was losing my balance, losing my grip on reality. But then, something snapped. I reached out, my fingers clawing at the dirt, pulling myself toward a small ledge. With everything I had left, I dug my hands into the earth and pulled myself up, my muscles screaming in protest. The ground was hard beneath my fingers, solid and real. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I stood, gasping for air, my whole body trembling. The whispers were still there, still calling to me, but now they sounded distant. The figure in the water was less clear, less defined, as if the strain of the confrontation had begun to affect it as much as it had me. It was no longer a solid entity, it was shifting, flickering, becoming more and more translucent. I could feel it. The lake was weakening. It was losing its hold on me. But it wasn't done yet. The water surged, reaching for me again, its dark tendrils twisting and lashing out with a malevolent hunger. The figure reached for me one last time, its claws extended, but I didn't hesitate. With every ounce of strength left in my body, I screamed, "No!" and shoved the stone into the water. It hit the surface with a force I hadn't expected, and the water erupted, sending a shock wave of force through the air. For a moment, everything froze. And then the figure in the water shattered. The dark entity dissolved into the lake, sinking beneath the surface, vanishing into the depths. The lake rippled, calmed, as if it had never been alive at all. But I knew better. I knew it wasn't over. The lake was still there. It still hungered. It always would. I stood there, panting, my whole body shaking, my mind on the edge of collapse. I had escaped, for now, but the lake's grip would never truly let me go. Not entirely. It was in my thoughts, in my fears. I would carry its mark forever. And as I turned to leave, I could hear one final whisper in my ear, "You will return." The sun had barely risen when I stumbled back to the campsite, my body shaking, drenched in sweat, but I couldn't tell if it was from the cold or from the fear that still gripped me. The world around me seemed unreal, like a bad dream that I couldn't wake up from. The air smelled different now, thicker, heavier, as if it had been soaked in the lake's darkness. I sat down on the damp ground, staring at the fire that I had built the night before, though it had long since died out. There was no warmth left. No comfort. Just a hollow, gnawing emptiness. It's over, I told myself. It's done. But even as the words formed in my mind, a deep sense of dread lingered, pressing in on me. I had escaped, hadn't I? I had fought it, I had fought them, and yet, my skin still burned as if the lake's coldness had sunk beneath my flesh. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting. I looked over my shoulder, expecting to see something lurking in the shadows of the trees, but all I saw was emptiness. Nothing. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breath, but the silence pressed in, suffocating me. I couldn't trust my senses anymore. Nothing felt right. The sounds around me were wrong, too quiet one moment, too loud the next. Every rustle of leaves seemed like the whispers of the lake, too faint to be real but too sharp to ignore. My thoughts, too, felt disjointed. A fragmented series of images, memories, fears, all jumbled together. One moment, I was standing on the shore, staring at the water's edge. The next, I was back in the forest, running, the ground trembling beneath my feet. It's nothing, I tried to tell myself. It's just the aftermath of what happened. Just the shock. But the whispers, they wouldn't stop. soft at first, like the wind through the trees, but growing louder, clearer. Words I didn't recognize, murmurs of a language that didn't exist. They pulled at the edges of my thoughts, coaxing me, promising me things that I didn't want to hear. "Leave," the whispers said. "Come back to us. You cannot escape." I clutched my head, trying to block out the voices, but the harder I tried, the louder they became, swirling around me like a storm I couldn't escape. I pressed my palms against my ears, but it didn't help. They were inside me now, lodged deep in my mind. The lake wasn't just a place. It was a part of me, and it was taking over. I looked down at my hands, feeling the rough calluses from fishing, the dirt embedded beneath my nails, but I couldn't be sure if they were my hands anymore. They looked different. Wrong. There were shadows in the creases of my palms, deep, dark shapes that I hadn't noticed before. I blinked, and the shadows shifted, forming into something alive. I jerked my hand back, breathing heavily, but when I looked again, they were gone. Nothing but the dirt and grime from the lake. "It's just the stress," I told myself, my voice trembling. "I need to sleep. I need rest. I'll be fine." But as I closed my eyes, the vision of the lake flooded back, sharp and vivid. The twisted figure in the water, its claws reaching for me, the coldness that wrapped around my chest, squeezing the breath from my lungs. The sinking feeling, like I was being pulled under. I couldn't escape. Not in my dreams. Not in my waking moments. Suddenly, I heard something, a rustling sound in the trees, followed by a distant voice, calling my name. My heart skipped a beat. "No," I thought, fighting to stay calm. "It's just the wind. It's just the wind." But the voice was clearer now, unmistakable. A whisper, deep and guttural, calling my name again. "Come back." My blood ran cold. I knew that voice. I had heard it before. It was the voice of the lake, of the thing that haunted me. I opened my eyes, and the world around me shifted. The trees were no longer just trees. They were watching me, their twisted branches reaching toward me, their leaves whispering in a language I couldn't understand. The shadows moved, slithering across the ground, forming shapes that I couldn't quite make out. And then I saw it, the water. It was there, right in front of me, though I knew I hadn't moved. The lake was no longer a distant memory. It was here, in my mind, in my soul. The figure from the water rose up before me, its eyes locked onto mine, its form more solid than ever, more real than it had ever been. The very air seemed to tremble with its presence. I tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, rooted to the spot. The whispers grew louder, the voice now directly in my ear, its cold breath like a blade against my skin. "You cannot escape us." I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry. I wanted to run, but my body refused to obey. I was trapped, caught in a web of illusions, drowning in the water's grip, unable to tell where the lake ended and I began. The whispers, the visions, the figure, they were all too much. The lines between what was real and what wasn't had disappeared. The lake had broken me. I wasn't sure if I was still alive. Was this all happening now, or had I already crossed over into whatever lay beneath the water's surface? I didn't know anymore. I only knew that I couldn't escape. Not from the lake. Not from what it had made me. I had spent hours pacing around the campsite, my mind spiraling in endless loops, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to leave. The lake had already taken so much from me, and I couldn't bear to stay any longer. The whispers were louder now, surrounding me like a suffocating fog, but I forced myself to move. I packed my belongings in a daze, the simple motions feeling mechanical, as if my body was acting on its own. Every step toward the car felt like wading through thick, heavy air. Each movement was an effort, my legs stiff and sluggish, my heart pounding with the instinct to escape. The trees loomed tall around me, the quiet of the forest unnerving. The normal sounds of wildlife, birds and rustling leaves, were absent. Only the distant, persistent murmur of the lake remained. I reached the edge of the clearing where my car was parked, but something caught my eye. A figure, standing in the distance, where the forest met the lake's edge. It was a silhouette, barely visible against the shifting shadows. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't want to see it. I didn't want to face it. But it was impossible to look away. As I stared, the figure stepped forward into the weak light, and I froze. It was him. My brother. I hadn't seen him in years. He had disappeared without a trace when we were children. Everyone had said he drowned, that he'd fallen into the lake. But they never found his body. I had always held onto the hope that it was a mistake, that he was out there somewhere, alive. But here he was, standing at the edge of the lake, staring at me. His face was pale, his eyes wide, unblinking, a look of emptiness that sent chills down my spine. The wind tugged at his hair, but his clothes remained perfectly still, as if he wasn't affected by the elements. The figure was almost unnatural, like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet felt glued to the ground, my breath caught in my throat. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be him. It was impossible. He was dead. What do you want from me? I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. It just stared, unblinking, unfeeling. The air around me grew colder, my body shaking as the fear began to consume me. And then, it spoke. You should have stayed away. The voice was faint, distant, but unmistakably his. I staggered backward, the words hitting me like a blow. I tried to force my legs to move, but I was rooted to the spot. The ground felt like it was swallowing me up, pulling me back toward the lake, toward him. Please, I gasped, the words barely escaping my lips. You're not real. You can't be. But he took a step closer, his eyes dark and hollow. His voice came again, softer this time, as if it was carried by the wind. I'm not the one who's real anymore. The world around me seemed to distort, the trees warping, the sky turning an unnatural shade. The lake behind him rippled, but the water wasn't moving in a natural way. It swelled and twisted, as if the surface was being stirred by something far beneath. I felt an overwhelming pull, like I was being drawn toward the water, like I was no longer in control of my own body. I'm sorry, I whispered, the tears rising in my throat. I didn't know. He said nothing, but his mouth curved into a slight, eerie smile. It wasn't him. Not really. It couldn't be. This was something the lake had dredged up, some twisted mockery of the brother I had lost. I finally tore my eyes away, forcing myself to look down, away from the figure, but the ground itself seemed to shift. The earth trembled, the ground beneath me cracking, as if something was trying to claw its way to the surface. My vision blurred, and I heard the whispers again, louder now, swirling around me like a storm. You should have stayed away, they echoed, the voice now everywhere, in my ears, in my mind, inside my very bones. I had to leave. I had to get out of here before the lake took everything from me. But as I turned, the trees behind me twisted into shapes that weren't trees at all, faces, grotesque and familiar, watching me with empty eyes. I wanted to scream, but the air was thick in my throat. The voice, my brother's voice, came again, but it was no longer him. It was a hollow, distorted mockery. You can't leave, not now. Not when you're already part of me. I stumbled backward, my vision spinning, the world around me folding in on itself. The lake had pulled me back, pulled me into something I couldn't understand. Something that didn't care about time or life or death. I had thought I could escape. But I was wrong. The lake had already claimed me long ago. I could feel it then, the weight of the lake pressing down on me, its dark influence crawling through my veins, consuming my thoughts. The air was thick with its presence, and every breath felt like I was inhaling the very essence of its twisted power. I could hear the whispers again, louder now, each one growing more insistent, more commanding. You belong to us now. You cannot escape. It is too late. I tried to block them out, but the more I fought, the stronger they became, flooding my mind with images, terrible visions of drowning, of endless darkness beneath the water, of faces twisted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams. I couldn't tell if they were memories or if they were just illusions conjured by the lake. But I knew one thing, the lake wanted me. It always had. The figure of my brother, the one I had desperately clung to in my mind, hoping for some connection, some piece of him that hadn't been lost, stood before me, his hollow eyes now dark voids. He was no longer a comforting memory, but a harbinger of what awaited me. His voice was the voice of the lake now, a deep, ominous echo in my skull. It's too late, he said again, his words slow and deliberate. You cannot fight it. You never could. The earth trembled beneath me, the trees growing as if the entire forest itself was alive, breathing with the lake. The ground seemed to split, a deep, dark chasm opening before me, its depths endless and black. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, as though nature itself was in league with the lake, a cruel force working together to pull me under. And yet, I couldn't move. My body refused to obey, frozen in place, caught between the past and the present, between the nightmare and reality. What do I do? My chest felt tight, my heart pounding so violently that I thought it might burst. The whispers were so close now, I could feel them brushing against my skin, cold and sharp. I wanted to scream, but my voice was lost in the suffocating silence that had taken over. I wanted to run, but the ground beneath me was no longer solid. It was shifting, warping, like the lake was trying to swallow me whole. The darkness seemed to spread from the water, crawling toward me, stretching out like fingers reaching for my soul. My brother, no, the thing that looked like him, stepped closer, his smile widening, an inhuman grin that sent a wave of nausea crashing through me. You can't escape, he said, his voice low and raspy, as if it had been carried on the wind for miles. You never could. You've already been claimed. The lake has chosen you. I closed my eyes, my hands trembling at my sides. I didn't know what to believe anymore. My thoughts felt like they were slipping away, like the very fabric of reality was unraveling. I can't stay here. I can't become part of this thing. But as I stood there, paralyzed by fear, I realized that the lake wasn't just some outside force. It had already seeped into my soul. It had always been there, in the shadows of my mind, waiting. It wasn't just the water. It was everything, the air, the earth, the wind. The lake was not a place, not a thing that could be escaped. It was a part of me now, and it wanted to consume me completely. I turned my gaze back to the lake. It called to me, its dark surface shimmering, pulling me in with promises of release. It was offering me a way out, a way to escape the madness of my mind, to end the torment that was gnawing at me from the inside. All I had to do was step forward, let go of the fear, and surrender. The choice was clear. I could surrender to the lake, let it claim me, let it erase everything. I could vanish into its cold embrace, and everything would stop. The whispers, the visions, the fear, they would all cease. I would be free, but in a way that meant losing everything that made me who I was. I would be lost to the lake, a victim of its endless, suffocating grip. But something inside me refused to let go. Something in me still fought to survive, to resist. I had seen the people it had claimed, their empty eyes staring out from the water, their faces twisted in eternal agony. I couldn't become one of them. I couldn't let it win. I turned away from the lake, shaking my head, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't know if I could fight it, if I had the strength left to do so, but I had to try. There was no going back. The only choice left was to fight, no matter how hopeless it seemed. I will not let this lake take me. I will not become one of its lost souls. I felt a surge of defiance, a spark of something that refused to be swallowed by the darkness. My legs were shaking, but I forced myself to move. Slowly at first, then faster, until I was running away from the lake, from the figure, from everything that wanted to pull me back. But as I ran, I realized something terrible. I didn't know where I was running to. The forest stretched on endlessly, the trees closing in around me. The ground seemed to shift beneath my feet, and the lake's presence was everywhere. No matter how fast I ran, I couldn't escape it. The lake had already claimed me. I just hadn't accepted it yet. And as I ran, I felt the air grow colder, my breath turning to mist. The whispers were no longer distant. They were inside my head, and I knew, deep down, that it was only a matter of time before I would be forced to make the ultimate decision, fight or surrender. The choice was mine, but I wasn't sure how much longer I could hold on. My heart was pounding so violently that it felt as though it might burst from my chest. The whispers had turned into a constant, maddening hum, a chorus of voices all clamoring for my attention, pulling me in every direction. The lake's presence was everywhere now, its dark influence seeping into every pore of my skin, filling my lungs with the cold, suffocating air. I could feel it beneath my feet, the ground shifting as though the very earth itself was alive, a part of the lake, calling to me, urging me to turn back, to stop running, to accept what was inevitable. My legs were heavy, each step feeling like I was moving through molasses. I was exhausted, too exhausted to keep fighting, too drained to keep running. Every muscle in my body screamed in protest, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't. Ahead of me, I saw it, the water. The lake, with its dark, rippling surface, beckoning like a void. My instincts screamed at me to turn away, to keep running, but my body felt like it was no longer mine. It was as if some invisible force was pulling me toward it, like gravity itself had changed, drawn by the pull of the lake's sinister power. The closer I got, the harder it became to fight. It's too strong, I thought. I can't fight it anymore. The whispers were deafening now, their voices overwhelming, filling my head with the certainty that it was pointless to resist. The lake was patient. It always had been. It had waited for so long to claim me, to pull me under its cold surface and drown everything that was me. I stumbled to my knees, the ground beneath me soft, like the earth had become part of the water, as though it was already reaching up, trying to drag me down. I could feel it, the lake's cold fingers just beneath the surface, pressing against me, pulling me toward the water. The air grew thick, pressing down on my chest as if the weight of the lake itself was suffocating me. No, I won't let it win. I shook my head, my thoughts a blur. I couldn't see clearly anymore. My vision was fading, darkness creeping in around the edges. I could hear the water, a constant, lapping sound, as if the lake was breathing, waiting for me to surrender. It was so close now, so close that I could feel the coldness of the water on my skin, could almost hear it call my name. I reached out, grabbing at the ground, but my hands slid on the damp earth, unable to find any solid ground. Every time I tried to push away, the pull of the water was stronger, like a hand grabbing at my ankle, dragging me into the depths. I can't. I took a deep breath, struggling to steady myself. The lake wasn't just pulling at my body, it was pulling at my mind, dragging me into a nightmare I couldn't escape. Each step I took felt like I was sinking deeper into quicksand, my legs unable to move, my body heavy, as if I were already drowning. I could feel the cold creeping up my legs, as if the water itself was rising, engulfing me. I could hear the figures from the lake whispering again, their voices filling the air, murmuring things I couldn't understand. It was too much. The fear, the hopelessness, the sense of being utterly alone in this place. I felt like I was losing myself. There's nowhere to go. I glanced over my shoulder, hoping to see a way out, but all I saw was darkness. The trees twisted unnaturally, their shapes distorted in the haze of my panic. The sky above seemed to close in, the air thick with a pressure that made it hard to breathe. The world itself was bending around me, warping, like a nightmare in full bloom. I had nothing left to give. No more strength, no more will to fight. But I can't let it win. The thought cut through the fog in my mind, sharp and clear. A desperate surge of defiance flared inside me, a final attempt to free myself from the grip of the lake. I wasn't ready to become just another victim, another lost soul claimed by its depths. I pushed forward, my fingers scraping against the dirt, reaching for anything that could help me stand. I fought through the overwhelming fear, the pounding in my head, the coldness that threatened to swallow me whole. I couldn't feel my legs anymore. My body was numb, as if it had already given in, but my mind refused. I reached the water's edge and, with every ounce of strength left in me, I dragged myself away, clawing through the mud and the dirt, feeling the lake's pull grow stronger. I could feel it beneath me, the pull of the water, the cold grasp of its depths, but I wasn't going to let it take me. The water rose around me, a swirling mass of shadows and shapes. It was alive in a way I couldn't understand, a darkness that reached out, pulling me under, trying to drown me. I screamed, my voice breaking, the sound lost to the wind. I fought against the tide, against the darkness, my hands reaching for anything to hold on to, but everything slipped away. Then, in one final, desperate act, I turned and ran. But the water wasn't just behind me. It was everywhere. And with each step, I felt it closing in. I was running, but I knew the truth now. The lake had me. It always had. I ran, my feet stumbling through the wet earth, but it was no use. The fear that clutched at my heart was far worse than any physical exhaustion. The air around me was thick, as if it had been laced with the very essence of the lake, smothering me with its presence. I could hear the water behind me, a soft but persistent sound, like a whisper at my back, ever close, ever waiting. No matter how fast I moved, no matter how many steps I took, the feeling that the lake was never far behind never left me. It had followed me from the moment I first arrived. I had thought it was just some weird local superstition, a story designed to keep people away, but now I knew the truth. The lake was not just a place, it was something more. Something ancient. Something that existed not just in the water but in the very air around me, in the dark spaces between the trees, in the shadows that moved when my back was turned. It feeds on fear, I thought, as I staggered through the forest, trying to outrun the panic. It feeds on loneliness, isolation. It thrives on them. The lake wasn't just a body of water, it was a force. A thing that had existed long before I ever stepped foot near its shores, and it had seen far too many souls come to its depths to feed its hunger. The legends, the warnings, all made sense now. It wasn't about the fish. It wasn't about the strange sounds or the shadows. It was about something much darker, something alive, feeding on those who came too close. I had been so naive to think I could control it, to think I could leave. There was no leaving now. There was only the constant pull of the lake, urging me back, drawing me into its grip. It wants me. It's always wanted me. I turned, gasping for breath, to look back at the lake. It was impossible to see, impossible to escape. Even now, as I stood in the darkness of the forest, I could feel its weight pressing down on me. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was there. I could feel the coldness in the air, the dampness that had crept into my bones. The whispers returned, faint at first, then louder, louder still, until they seemed to fill the entire forest, swirling around me like the wind. "You can't run," the voices seemed to say. "You're already here." I couldn't escape. There was no place where I could hide from the lake, no safe distance where it couldn't reach me. It had found me. It had marked me the moment I set foot near its shores, and now it wouldn't let go. The isolation I had felt, the sense of being alone, abandoned, distant from everything I knew, had only been the lake drawing me in. The fear had been its first step. It was feeding off it, growing stronger with each passing moment. And I was helpless. I sank to my knees, my breath shallow, my thoughts spinning in a tangled mess. It wasn't just my body it had claimed, it was my mind, too. The hallucinations, the shadows in the water, the voices in the wind, the sensation of being watched. It was all a part of it. The lake was never just a physical thing. It was a force, a malign presence that fed on everything I had. My fear, my panic, my isolation. And now, it was consuming me whole. The coldness of the night seemed to deepen as I knelt there, my eyes wide and frantic, searching the dark. I couldn't even tell anymore if I was imagining the water lapping at my feet or if it was real. Was the lake already here, its icy fingers reaching up to drag me back? Or was it simply in my mind, a product of the fear it had planted in me? I wanted to scream, but the sound got caught in my throat. The lake had already stolen my voice. The words I wanted to say were lost to the dark, to the force that was now settling deep inside me, in my bones, in my soul. The lake had already won. It was only a matter of time before I was just another ghost, another figure lost to the depths. And the most terrifying part of all? I knew it wouldn't stop. It would never stop. I was part of the lake now. I reached the edge of the lake, or what I thought was the edge. The familiar, haunting ripples on the surface should have been a relief, a sign that I was almost free. But as I stood there, gazing out across the water, a terrible realization sank in. This wasn't the same place I had come from. The land had shifted. The trees that once bordered the lake were twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, blocking any sense of direction. I had been so sure that I was near the end of this nightmare, but now it felt like I was deeper in it than ever. The shore was no longer a smooth, gentle curve. It was jagged and sharp, as though the earth had been torn apart and rearranged. The water looked different too. The surface, once calm and still, now seemed to churn and boil with an unnatural energy, ripples curling inward as if the lake itself was alive, reacting to my presence. How did I get here? I thought, panic rising in my chest. Where did everything go? I glanced back toward the forest, hoping to find a path or some sign that I had been here before, but the trees only seemed to grow darker, their twisted limbs blotting out the moonlight. There were no familiar landmarks, no sense of orientation. My footsteps felt uncertain, as if I were walking in a dream, each step pulling me deeper into a place that had no beginning or end. The whispers were louder now, filling the air around me, so loud they nearly drowned out the sound of my own breathing. They came from everywhere, from the earth beneath my feet, from the water that lapped against the shore, from the very trees themselves. It was impossible to tell if they were voices, or if the lake was speaking through the wind, through the night. It wants me to stay, I realized. The thought came to me with a clarity that made my heart skip a beat. It doesn't want me to leave. I backed away from the water, my eyes searching desperately for a way out. But no matter where I turned, the landscape shifted, each angle looking more alien than the last. The ground beneath me trembled as though the earth itself was rejecting me, as though the lake had already sunk its roots into the land, spreading out like a malign force, claiming everything it touched. I stumbled, disoriented, my heart racing. The further I walked, the more the surroundings seemed to warp. The trees that once seemed menacing now loomed overhead like dark, twisted giants, and the water no longer reflected the sky but instead seemed to pull inward, as though the surface was a portal to something far darker beneath. I'm trapped. It was a sickening realization, one that hit me harder than any fear or terror I'd felt before. The lake had me. It wasn't just the fear, or the whispers, or the shadows in the water. It was something far deeper. Something that had woven itself into the very fabric of this place, pulling me closer, keeping me from ever leaving. No way out. My hands trembled as I reached for my head, my mind struggling to make sense of it all. How had I let this happen? How had I allowed myself to be consumed by something so invisible, so insidious? I had walked into the lake's trap with my eyes wide open, believing that I could escape when I wanted, that I could outrun its reach. But now I knew better. The lake wasn't just a place. It was a force, a presence, a part of this world in a way that no one could truly understand. And once it had you, there was no leaving. I turned to face the water again, its surface now a deep, suffocating black, reflecting nothing but emptiness. The whispers were louder now, all-encompassing, surrounding me like a cold, suffocating fog. There was nowhere to run, no place to hide. Every step I took felt heavier, as though I were sinking deeper into the earth itself, drawn closer to the water's edge. And then, just as my vision blurred and the darkness around me thickened, I felt it. The pull. It was slow at first, a gentle tug, but it quickly became undeniable, a force that wrapped around me, inside of me. The lake was calling me, pulling me toward it, urging me to step into the water. I could feel its icy fingers brushing against my skin, its cold, unforgiving touch, pulling me closer to the edge. I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the ground, my body frozen as the lake's pull grew stronger. My mind screamed for escape, but my limbs felt numb, useless. The whispers filled my ears, a chorus of voices urging me, calling me to surrender, to step into the water and embrace what it promised. I tried to fight it, but my strength was gone. The lake had already claimed me, body and soul. And with one final, helpless breath, I let it take me. The water closed over my head, and there was nothing. The water continued to beckon me, its surface now a glistening black abyss, drawing me in with an almost magnetic force. It was impossible to ignore the cold, the pull, the way the whispers seemed to swell in the air around me, growing louder and more insistent. My mind raced, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to make sense of the terror that overwhelmed me. The whispers were no longer just a faint murmur. They were clear, distinct voices now, each one vying for my attention. They weren't the same as before, when they had been distant and disjointed. Now, they spoke directly to me, wrapping themselves around my thoughts, as if trying to take control. "Stay," one whispered, a smooth, coaxing voice that felt strangely familiar, as though it had once belonged to someone I knew. "You don't have to fight anymore. Let go. It's easier this way." Another voice followed, sharp and urgent, but still strangely comforting. "Rest. The lake will protect you. It will keep you safe from the pain. You don't need to run anymore. You belong here." The words were so tempting. A part of me, deep down, buried beneath the fear and terror, longed to listen. The weight of exhaustion hung heavily on me, and the thought of giving in, of simply letting go, seemed almost like relief. For so long, I had been running, fighting against the pull of the lake, against the fear and the uncertainty that had consumed me. But what if it was true? What if this was the way to escape it all, to finally end the torment? "You've been alone for so long," one of the whispers continued, softer now, almost tender. "Come back to us. You won't be alone anymore. We can give you peace." I felt a shudder run through me as the promises flooded my mind. The idea of peace, of relief from the constant terror that gripped me, seemed almost too good to be true. The weight of my fear and exhaustion made my limbs heavy, my thoughts muddled. For a brief moment, I was tempted to step closer to the water, to give in to the whispers, to embrace the warmth that seemed to emanate from the dark lake. It promised solace, a way out from the torment that had plagued me for what felt like an eternity. But then, a stronger part of me broke through the fog of fear and exhaustion. I clenched my fists, trying to fight the urge to listen. No. I couldn't. I couldn't give in. The whispers, they were lies, all of them. The lake wasn't offering me peace, it was offering me destruction. It was offering me an eternity of darkness, an endless trap where I would never escape, where I would become one with the lake and its insatiable hunger. I am not its victim, I thought, forcing my feet to stay rooted to the ground, though every fiber of my being screamed to turn and jump into the water. I will not let it win. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but I pushed them aside. "No," I muttered, my voice shaky but firm. "I won't stay. I won't let you take me." The pull of the lake seemed to intensify, the water now creeping closer to my feet, its icy chill lapping at my ankles, urging me to step forward. But I refused to let it have me. The voices screamed in my head, each one promising a different version of peace, but all I could hear was the dark truth beneath their words, the lake's hunger, its insidious power, its ability to twist the truth and make it seem so sweet. "You'll never escape," the voices hissed, their tone shifting to one of malice. "We will always find you. You cannot fight us. We are everything." The fear bubbled up again, but this time something inside me refused to bend. The lake was a monster, feeding on everything I had, my fear, my loneliness, my desperation. But I was stronger than it. I had to be. With every ounce of willpower left in me, I took a step back, away from the water, away from the whispers. My heart hammered in my chest, but I forced myself to stand tall. The pull of the lake still clawed at me, but I fought it. I would not let it consume me. The air was thick with the weight of the lake's anger, the sense of something ancient and primal rising up from the depths. But I could feel the edges of my fear starting to crumble. The lake could tempt me, it could try to pull me in, but it could never own me. "I'm not yours," I whispered through clenched teeth. "I'll never be yours." The whispers faltered for a moment, the silence almost deafening. The water stopped its slow creep, as though momentarily stunned by my resistance. I felt the tension in the air, the sense that the lake was watching, waiting for me to give in. But I wouldn't. I couldn't. And for the first time since I'd arrived at the lake, I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of my fear lift just a little. It wasn't over yet. But I wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. The lake lay before me, its surface smooth and glass-like, reflecting nothing but the darkened sky above. The whispers had returned, but this time they were different. There was no tenderness, no promise of relief. Only a cold, relentless hunger. The very air around me seemed to shimmer with malevolent energy, as if the lake itself were waiting, anticipating my next move. I could feel its presence, something ancient, vast, and insidious lurking just beneath the water's surface. I knew it was there. I could sense its waiting, biding time. The figure I had glimpsed in the depths before, the thing that had haunted my every step, every thought, was finally ready to reveal itself. I had no more illusions about what the lake was, or what it wanted. I stood there for what seemed like an eternity, torn between the irrational urge to run and the undeniable force that was pulling me forward. I had come this far. I had resisted its whispers, its temptations. But the fear, the overwhelming, paralyzing fear, was still there, clawing at my insides, urging me to flee, to escape. Yet I knew there was no running from this. I couldn't escape what I had already found. Taking a deep breath, I stepped closer to the water's edge, the cool air brushing against my skin. My heart was racing, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. My feet were moving before my mind could even fully comprehend what I was doing. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the lake itself was drawing me in, pulling me closer to the point of no return. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, swirling around me in a frenzy of voices. "You can't fight it. You belong to us now. You always have." I waded deeper, the water rising steadily around my legs, cold and thick like tar. My knees trembled with fear, but I forced myself to keep going. The sensation of something brushing against my skin beneath the water made my stomach churn, but I couldn't look back. If I did, I knew I would lose my resolve. As I reached the middle of the lake, the water was up to my chest. The surface rippled, and I thought I saw something moving beneath it, dark shapes, circling like hungry fish, watching, waiting. And then it emerged. A figure. Not like anything I had seen before. It wasn't human, yet it wasn't entirely alien either. It was as if the lake had taken everything it had ever consumed, the souls, the fear, the broken minds, and formed them into a single, grotesque entity. Its form twisted and writhed beneath the surface, its features constantly shifting, becoming a jumbled mixture of faces and shadows. I couldn't look away, even as my breath became shallow, my heart hammering in my chest. It was no longer just a creature of nightmares. It was real. It was here, in front of me. The thing I had been running from, the thing that had haunted my every thought, had finally risen. The lake, in its ancient hunger, had given it life. Its presence enveloped me, a dark cloud that seemed to press against my chest, suffocating me, drowning me in an overwhelming sense of dread. I could feel it reaching out, its cold tendrils snaking through my thoughts, pulling at the very fabric of my mind. I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my throat. "You've come for me," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the rushing sound in my ears, the noise of the water as it crashed around me. The figure moved, its limbs stretching unnaturally, the air around it thick with the weight of its power. It seemed to laugh, though no sound came from its twisted form. The lake itself seemed to echo with the vibrations of its movement, a deep, unnatural hum that resonated through the ground beneath my feet. "You should have stayed away," it seemed to say, its voice no longer just a whisper, but a booming, all-encompassing force. "You were never meant to leave." The water began to churn violently, pulling me deeper, dragging me down as if the lake itself were trying to consume me. Panic surged within me as I struggled to stay afloat, but the force beneath me was too strong. My legs kicked in vain, the cold water seeping into my lungs, filling me with terror. I tried to fight it, tried to scream, but the water filled my mouth, choking me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The entity's presence overwhelmed me, crashing into me from all sides, and in that moment, I realized the truth. The lake wasn't just a place. It was alive. It was a force that existed beyond comprehension, feeding on fear, on isolation, on the broken souls it had claimed over the years. It wasn't content with simply luring people in, it needed them, needed their fear, their desperation to survive. It had been waiting for me all along, watching from beneath the surface, biding its time until I finally made the mistake of stepping in too deep. I had fallen for its trap. There was no escape. As the water closed over my head, I saw the figure once more, its distorted, ever-changing form hovering just above me. Its gaze locked onto mine, and in its eyes, I saw everything I had ever feared, everything I had ever wanted to escape. The last thing I felt before the darkness took me was the lake's cold embrace, pulling me down into its depths, into its eternal grasp. And in that moment, I knew I had become part of it, just as it had always intended. There would be no returning. No escape. Only silence. Only the lake. I don't know how long I was submerged in the cold, crushing darkness of the lake. It felt like an eternity, the world around me distorted and muffled, my mind struggling to grasp reality. I couldn't move, couldn't think clearly. The lake had already taken me, its grip was too tight, too all-encompassing. There was no escaping it. My lungs burned, my body screamed for air, but the water filled every inch of my being. I tried to thrash, to fight my way to the surface, but it was as if something was pulling me deeper, further down, until I no longer knew which direction was up. Panic surged through me, an instinctual fear of drowning, of being swallowed whole. But there was something worse, something much worse, than drowning. It was the realization. I had heard the stories, heard the warnings from the locals, the whispers about those who had disappeared near the lake. I had dismissed them, told myself it was superstition, a tale spun by fearful minds. But now, trapped in the lake's suffocating embrace, I understood the truth. The lake never lets go. It doesn't simply drown its victims. It claims them, remakes them into something else. Something darker. There's no finality, no end. The lake doesn't kill, it absorbs, transforms, and waits. It waits for those it has marked to join its endless cycle, to become part of its twisted, living web. As the water pressed against my chest, my body growing weaker, I realized the horror I had failed to comprehend all along. The lake doesn't let you leave. Not when you come, not when you try to escape, and certainly not when you drown. It's a trap, a snare that takes root deep within the soul, gnawing at the mind until there's nothing left but fear. Fear that feeds the lake, that keeps it alive, that keeps it hungry. I had thought that the physical danger was what mattered, that I could fight my way out. But I was wrong. The lake doesn't kill in the way we understand it. It doesn't need to. The real terror of the lake isn't the drowning or the visions or the creature that lurks beneath. It's the realization that it will never let you go. I could feel it, the presence of the lake itself, weaving through my mind like a parasite. It was making its way into my thoughts, taking root in my consciousness. I could hear its whispers again, louder this time, clearer, more insistent. You're part of it now, they hissed. There's no escape. You belong to the lake. And I knew it was true. The lake had never intended to let me go. It didn't matter how much I fought, how much I tried to run. It had taken me, just as it had taken so many before me. It had been waiting for me, pulling me in, leading me here. The worst part wasn't even that I had been chosen. It was that now I understood. Now I knew that the others who had vanished, the ones the locals spoke of, hadn't truly disappeared. They had become part of the lake, absorbed into its endless, eternal hunger. It had claimed them, and it was now claiming me. I wanted to scream, to fight, to claw my way back to the surface. But I could no longer feel my limbs. My body felt heavy, as though the water was pulling the very life out of me, one agonizing inch at a time. I was sinking further, deeper into the depths. The whispers grew louder, and I could no longer distinguish them from my own thoughts. The lines between what was real and what was the lake's illusions had blurred beyond recognition. In my final moments, as my body gave into the cold, dark grip of the water, I realized the horrible truth. The lake doesn't just claim its victims, it keeps them. Forever. There was no escape. No way out. Only the lake. It would never let go. I don't know why I finally lost consciousness. Maybe it was when the cold took over, or when the darkness swallowed the last remnants of my will to fight. But somewhere, beneath the water, I stopped struggling. My body no longer had the strength to resist, and my mind, too exhausted to think clearly, let go. In that moment of surrender, I felt it. The lake's grip tightened, wrapping around me like an unbreakable chain, pulling me deeper into its depths. I could hear the whispers again, but they were no longer voices, just a constant, all-encompassing hum, like the beating of 1,000 hearts, all beating as one. It was the lake itself, alive, breathing, feeding. I thought I was dead. I thought that, at last, I would find peace in the silence of the deep, in the eternal stillness of the water. But that peace never came. Instead, I felt a strange shift, an awful understanding of what the lake had done to me, what it had turned me into. It wasn't enough that it had claimed my body, it had already begun to claim my mind. It was altering me, reshaping me, transforming me into something that belonged to the lake, something that could never escape. I could feel the water inside me, inside my thoughts, pushing through every crack in my consciousness, drowning my sense of self. The lake was now in me. And though I was still breathing, though I had somehow returned to the surface, gasping for air, I knew I was already gone. The world above the water was different. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the lake, but everything seemed wrong. The trees appeared twisted, their branches reaching toward me like hands, beckoning me back. The air felt thick, heavy with the same strange hum that had filled the depths. The very landscape had shifted, warped by the lake's influence. I stumbled away from the water's edge, my feet unsteady, but I couldn't escape it. It followed me, clung to me, whispering in my ear, filling my every thought. It was in my blood now, in my bones, a part of me. The thing that had haunted me, the lake, the entity beneath its surface, had marked me. And even as I walked, even as I tried to leave, I knew it wouldn't let me go. Not truly. I would never be free of it. The lake was now inside me. It had shaped me, twisted my mind, and I would carry its horrors with me for the rest of my life. Its whispers would follow me wherever I went, haunting my dreams, clouding my thoughts, pulling me back to the water over and over again. Every drop of water, every darkened shadow would remind me of the lake's grip. I could never forget it. I could never escape it. The horror of the lake wasn't just in its depths. It was in everything, in every moment after. It never truly takes its victims. It makes them part of it, forever. And as I walked, my mind a haze of confusion and terror, I knew one thing for certain: I had been changed. The lake had consumed me, not in body, but in spirit. I would never be the same again. And it would never stop haunting me. It had won. This has been a long, dark journey through the night with Whisper Crowley. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Leave a like if these stories made you look at the darkness a little differently, and share in the comments what you enjoyed most or what gave you chills. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next Sinister Whispers. Until we meet again in the world of shadows.